And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. Oh, what a fantastic crowd we have out there in the ideas room already. Of course, tonight I am joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And Olivia, I hope that someone gets my message in a bottle.
Mm-hmm.
Because in this case, this is something kind of rather remarkable we're going to be laying out for you tonight. And, we hear a lot of different things in relation to the Kennedy case of JFK assassination. And there are a lot of details that have come out, but we're approaching the 60th anniversary. And tonight I have something rather mind blowing that locks in directly with the research we've been doing here on the X series. And it's just so fascinating. And it is now a part of public record. And so we're going to lay that out for you tonight. Tonight's special episode, the JFK Assassination Bombshell, Byrd Antarctica Nazis and the UFO file. There's a lot of areas and a lot of range there, but this is the return of the X series and its X series episode 155. A couple of interesting things to comment on here as we roll into September. It's already like the summer's losing us a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
but we do have this very interesting thing of people getting back into focus. And it's interesting because actually RFK Jr. has been making the rounds, doing some interviews and getting his groove back on for campaign 2024. He's been doing some interesting things around the JFK assassination and speaking more and more openly about those who are behind it. This is very significant going into 2024, as is the UFO file. And I've advised both the, publicly here on the show, both the RFK campaign and the Trump campaign to get out in front of that UFO file because they're going to use it front and center as the master centerpiece for the 2024 election. And if anyone can bring that home, the two of them certainly can. But there are some things I will say in relation to both campaigns where they could be stressing and emphasizing some major positives that they have. Trump on the economy, for example, and Bobby's transparency, that is a little bit getting glossed over. So whoever's in charge of those campaigns, I would get on that ASAP, especially since both of them play right into this JFK records release piece. As a matter of fact, President Trump came back out and said in a post yesterday that we need the truth, all in caps, about the JFK assassination. Well, he's on the record. Bobby's on the record. Let's have it out because what's hanging out there relates directly to what we're going to be presenting tonight. And it is definitely explosive. It's interesting, too, because of the arc of how all of this fits in with what Professor Peter Dale Scott refers to as the deep state. And so much of this running from 1963 to 2023, a 60-year cycle complete on November 22nd of this year. So we're going to be laying out a lot of those fantastic details. A lot of great comments and support from everyone on the previous episode dealing with Edgar Casey and some of the remarkable things that were there on the record for us to go back and explore in relation to Edgar Casey around the 21st century. So crucial. And tonight, the kind of psychic corner in the episode is played by Crocet the Clairvoyant. And Crocet plays a major role in here. And I'll put this on the record. Around any significant geopolitical event, there is always a mystical psychic element. And tonight, it's Crocet.
Cool.
Very, very interestingly. I'm going to remind everyone that in the second half of tonight's program, we're going to be taking your questions. And you can ask those all in caps with Miss Olivia now. And she's putting them all together before I go any further. Miss Olivia, how are we doing out there?
Doing great. Irish Guy at Second Chance Recovery says, I'm ready for a good, healthy dose of freedom and DJ. And Lois says, does anyone else hear the ticking of a bomb of new JFK information?
Well, it's quite significant. And it's interesting because it comes out of a court document. And there's no question that the person who provided the court document has to be an avid watcher of the show because of the things that it refers to come directly out of the X series. This is an interesting thing too, and I think a lot of authors go through this. Professor Scott, Dr. Farrell, others, where their work just shows up in these unusual places, and they can be cited or not cited. But if they're not cited, it feels a little bit weird. It'd be like somebody coming out and saying, "Oh, hey, I've got all this great stuff on Giza Death Star," and not citing Farrell. So it is very interesting. And what I find, this is also fascinating when it comes to people like Scott and others, they're excellent at citing sources. There's no question about where their sources are. And he will say, well, this came out of this book. This is in reference to this author and all the rest of it. There's something missing around independent media in relation to this. Mainstream media, forget it, but because they're plagiarists on overdrive. But in the independent media, it probably should be much more clear about where certain ideas come from and whether you agree with that author or not. And I find that there's a lot of borrowing of material in the X series case, certainly. And what's interesting is so much of the X work that we've done here is about original analysis around these very big topics, and it draws upon the great information out there in history, all the way from Kenneth Arnold and Donald Kehoe, back to Rudolf Steiner and others. I'll never be shy about citing where the sources are, but it's very interesting because this case that I'm going to refer to tonight comes directly out of the X series, but we're not mentioned anywhere, and maybe that's a good thing. I also want to remind everyone before we even get started tonight. Oh, Gigi Young is another one who's incredibly plagiarized. I see her work all over the place and very, often not cited. Much better if it's cited. It keeps things honest. And it's interesting too because what I've been noticing is a trend in these kind of hatched media operations like News Nation, for example, where they will pilfer through the UFO file, say over the past 70 years, grab out the topics. It's like there's somebody sitting there in a marketing room throwing things at a wall and then roll out the special, kind of puppets that they want to talk about these things. And unfortunately, this happens. It was the Rogan show. I just showed you that. And it's fascinating because Rogan had on George Knapp and Corbell talking about Grush, and they were trying to save the Grush operation, which faltered badly after the July 26 hearings with the revelations that he'd been in a psychiatric facility and all these other things, only because of course, it becomes part of the dialogue and the question around UFO disclosure if the person involved has psychological issues. That's one thing. But the not disclosing it either on the side of News Nation and Russ Coulthart and Grush himself, that they left that out, even as they seem to ask a faux question about it, like, is there any issue that you have that would make the public doubt what you're saying? And Grush says no. And, Coulthart is like, that's good enough for me. But in fact, we know that Coulthart was informed of all these incidents and just, I guess, hoped that the stuff wasn't going to come out. So that's the kind of deceptive media right in the inception of something. Remember, News Nation is brand new. The Grush story is new. And right at the beginning, you have lies. So that's the problem when we get into this field around TTSA, around Elizondo. But now this is spreading back to Rogan. Now, Rogan backed a bunch of claims around Lazar and all this stuff were very, very shaky, and they let this stuff kind of rotate through. Now, this might be a guy, in the case of Joe Rogan, who is interested to find out what really is going on. Unfortunately, he keeps going back to these intel mouthpieces and marketeers. So when people ask me, has Joe Rogan ever done a UFO show, I always say, I hope he will, but he hasn't yet. And we're going to find out why. But certainly, if you're doing these NAP, Grush, carnival sideshows, that has nothing to do with UFOs. And the sooner that they learn that side of it, the better. Maybe they're happy because it's good marketing numbers. And hey, if you get $300 million from Spotify, do you really care? I guess that's the problem in the nature of all this. Well, we care here. I try very hard to make sure that the things that we're talking about relate directly to the subject matter and can be cited in terms of the sources that we're talking about. That's crucial. But I do find, there is a kind of a fluff thing that happens around these subjects, and it's inevitable. And yet, in this particular period of time where we're looking at a looming threat and use of the UFO file for political purposes is very dangerous in a way that, say, it wouldn't be 5 years ago, even if it were objectionable then. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We are going deep tonight. The JFK assassination breakthrough, Byrd Antarctica Nazis, and the UFO file. And Byrd is the word, because it's not just Admiral Byrd, but it's DH, or Dry Hole Byrd, and Senator Harry Byrd. So the Byrds are very, very deep in there tonight. And it's interesting. I can say very openly, when it comes to some of the things that I'm using for the Nazi aspect of tonight's show, that this is very deep in Dr. Farrell's work and the SS Brotherhood of the Bell and things of this nature that really keep us on track with where did that advanced technology move to? Hello, Argentina. And how it moves through that system. Professor Peter Dale Scott's work, the deep state, and how it's moved since its inception and through organizations like the OPC that became the CIA and others. It's very important because there's a body of work there. There's a lot of people who have followed in the footsteps of some of these great researchers like Peter Dale Scott, who's still around and doing research. Don't get me wrong. Professor Scott is incredibly sharp and still producing excellent content and commentary. But some of the people who are following in his footsteps are very good also. They take the inspiration. The only thing that I've been noticing is, after talking with him extensively about the deep state and what it is, one of the things that he puts as the foundation is the intelligence groups and the mafia. But the way that he layers this is very important, and people have been flipping the layers so that the mafia stuff is on top, informing the intelligence part. That's not the way it works. It's the other way around. The intelligence part informs the mafia part, and that's where the coalition comes from. And the intelligence agencies have used that system of organized crime for decades, and originally under the guise of fighting the communists and for other things. But it's very important when you get into these subjects, the order in which they're taken in. And what's fascinating is I find these people who do excellent, excellent research around the mafia side of it. And, I won't say who the author is, but there was a book recently by a guy who does excellent research around the Kennedy assassination. A lot of those deep state researchers do, and they make the UFO field look pitiful in a sense when it comes to the level of research that they do. And I always say what's strong on the UFO side is that they don't have the deep state understanding or the deep state articulation of what the government's capable of in that background. That's so crucial. But they do understand that there's a UFO file in operation. So the UFO researchers, for whatever other faults they have, they understand this. And then on the deep state side, it's much more rich with understanding the backgrounds, how it affects geopolitics, the families involved, the money involved, much less of a naive take. So the deep state researchers, when they look at the UFO field, they say to themselves, I'm not going to go near that. And with good reason. But unfortunately, at this phase in history, all of those people, it would be much better field if those people came in and really took this subject seriously. But it's interesting because this author who was tackling the JFK assassination was doing a great job. And then he gets to the mafia part about the CIA, and he's actually talking about how the mafia gave orders to the CIA to do the assassination. So, it's interesting. So we're all, people are getting in the right ballpark, but the order, very, very crucial when we get into these things. So I wanted to mention this before we start at all, is that there's a lot of information about censorship kicking in prior to the real kickoff of the 2024 election, which is really upon us. And now those systems are tightening and tightening and tightening. One of the things that I found was a series of articles all about how YouTube and GoFundMe in particular are going after now leftist liberals who are disagreeing with the Ukraine war.
Wow.
So we're so used to them silencing conservatives, but this is the thing that I've warned about before, which is, wherever that snake can turn at any point, and wherever it decides to turn itself, just like I think that the current obsession around, there's no gender and all this kind of stuff could easily be turned into an Ayatollah like thing of calling out people for their lack of morality and stuff like that. So we have to watch how that system will use any ideology. Remember, inside the intelligence agencies, there's a saying, which is there is no truth. It's just what it is that they use to accomplish their aims. And that's very important for us to keep in mind. But the censorship part has been on overdrive. And I'm going to be reading some of those stories. One of them in particular, which came via Matt Taibbi talking about a person who was involved with all this criticism around the Ukraine war and them shutting off first his monetization of his channel and then just zapping him out. And then the next thing that happens is when he's in the middle of a GoFundMe, they're just so those systems are prepared to strike on the right side of the fence, on the left side of the fence. It doesn't matter. And so it needs to be a group effort to make those systems honest or provide alternatives. And we're seeing the alternatives take off dramatically. And a lot of them are doing really good. But I think the general inspiration is all of these systems, whether it's YouTube, Twitter, I'm not going to say X on the X series. And I have been getting a lot of emails from people about this Elon version of the X series and the thing that we reported 3 or 4 weeks ago. I haven't seen any further development on that. That was something that was floated out there that they're in production with a number of things. And one of the things they were going to do was a show called the X series about news. Hey, this sounded familiar. But either they may have actually, got the word from what we were doing, or we'll just see in development what's taking place. But as soon as anything pops up, or if anyone out there sees something in relation to this X series by Musk, then tell me all about it. Admin at Dark Journalist. How does that sound to you? All right. We're going to travel back in time. We're coming up here in November to the 60th anniversary of the assassination of President Kennedy. On this show, we've interviewed everyone from Dick Russell, Peter Dale Scott, the late Jim Marrs, who have really done the hard work and heavy lifting to find out what really happened on November 22nd, 1963. The echoes now in the 2024 campaign with RFK Jr. there, and then all of these other things coming forward. Trump talking about releasing the records, the Napolitano revelation about his conversations with Trump saying the first time around, I cannot release these records because what's in there is just too terrible, which is a big thing for someone like Trump to say. And we have other people on the record with Trump saying the same thing. There's a whole level of X technology that gets right into the heart of what the assassination is. So traditionally, people have looked and said, are there anti-Castro Cubans that were involved? And are there the mafia and all these things? Those things are what were cycled out there as potentialities as a way to cover the CIA's tracks back in the 1960s and 70s. In fact, the only kind of mafia involvement in the Kennedy assassination is the fact of personnel that can be brought in via the intelligence agencies. Now, when you get into a lot of the lies that have been told, a lot of it has fallen away to the point where some of the things about the Kennedy assassination, like Lee Harvey Oswald and the magic bullet, hey, one bullet does 7 wounds and things like this. And the setup for the story about Oswald being a communist, on the independent research track, all of these stories have come out over the course now of 60 years that have completely deflated that official version. So what do? You sit there and you're completely not believed. And also it becomes very obvious that the things that have been said about the intelligence agencies, because they've spent 6 decades trying to cover up the crime, it sort of moves to that, their complicity in the whole situation. Now, some people have turned to various theories around the Kennedy assassination. And I think that the idea that there was a series of reasons holds up very well over time, including the general independent streak of Kennedy when it came to finance, when it came to the wars, and the war machine. But the one that is not cited often enough and is incredibly obscure and yet incredibly significant is JFK's involvement with the UFO file and sharing that information with the Russians, which is something that very secret forces that I refer to as X-Protect on this program didn't want him to do. This is the key piece of information, which is the UFO file is something that President Kennedy knew a great deal about and that he was assassinated over. So that we're going to lay out how this works and how the figures involved get into alternative technology, get into alternative experimental aerospace. As a matter of fact, when Lee Harvey Oswald walked into the Texas School Book Depository, interestingly enough, he was walking into a building owned by someone who was in charge of an experimental aerospace company. Yes, he was an oil man, but his aerospace interests were at the helm there. And it's interesting because he's just walking out of in New Orleans, working for someone, Guy Bannister, who was in charge of the FBI UFO file. He was the one who brought it to bear. So we get aerospace immediately when you get around the JFK assassination. We've laid out some of those things over the course of time on this show. Tonight, a number of people, including Jim Marrs, Mae Brussel, and others, have talked about the fascist connection and presence in the JFK assassination, that fascist post-Nazi element. And Dr. Farrell has brought this forward as well. I think Farrell, Brussel, and a few others really have brought it forward. And it's been largely ignored, in fact, because it gets into kind of, this territory which seems almost unbelievable. But when you tie the UFO aspect in and you think of the level that the Germans were at with the UFO file at the point of the official demise of the Third Reich, then it starts to, that advanced technology track starts to open things up. If we just think of it as X technology, which is something, over 200 episodes, we've explored this, but basically, you don't have to attribute it to an off-world source. But I will say this, it's probably both, because just like the X technology that was created by Tesla and some of the advanced death rays things and the things that he brought forward, John Keeley brought forward, that falls into one category of this X technology. The UFO file seems to produce the exact same effects. And there's a particular effect involved with both I refer to as apotheum. All those things are going to be very important for us to keep our eye on the ball as we go forward into this history of the Byrds and LBJ and JFK, the Texas School Book Depository, because they're going to make a lot more sense in this context of an advanced technology. And if some people think that just UFOs are a psyop, I think they're missing a big picture. However, you can, with the X technology, navigate the same information and attributing it to a human source. Both exist, both seem to correlate at this one place in our history, but that aspect around the UFO cannot be denied. And that has been a big piece of what's missing over the past 75 years of research around the deep state. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is JFK Assassination Breakthrough X Series 155, X Byrd, Antarctica Nazis, and the UFO File. So we're going to go back here to November 22nd, 1963. Some very unusual things are in play. And before I go there, Miss Olivia, you're up.
Martin K. O'Connor says, what was Guy Bannister's responsibility for the UFO file? And Dow Jones Muller says, didn't Guy Bannister intimidate UFO witnesses?
He did. Well, he was also on a kind of fact-finding expedition, which is what's going on here. But he created the X file. So Security Matter X was the original thing, and then they just abbreviated it to X. So, in fact, what we understand as the X-Files and the TV shows and all that stuff comes directly out of this. One of the people who exposed the same early cases that he was running around checking on was someone named Frank Scully. That's where they got the TV name for the character. And we just did a show on the Aztec case a couple of months ago, and it's extraordinary the things that are palpable in that case and still unfolding, and the presence of certain people in it. So, for me, you have this opening around the Roswell case, and then in 1948, you get to the Aztec case, and the Aztec case is shut down so hard by a variety of forces, and it's pushed heavy and hard, the clampdown by the FBI, that you have to wonder exactly what was going on with that. And if that wasn't a case where they were getting oh so close to the truth, they were able to rub Roswell out to a certain degree. But this one, they had to discredit to a point that when it was brought back up, it still had all these people saying, "Oh no, it was just a hoax," and there was some guy trying to sell like an oil pump. Like, I mean, complete nonsense. So if you look back at Scully's work, you're find yourself right in that same milieu. But yeah, Bannister, the presence of Bannister in the JFK assassination signals immediately that you're in UFO territory. In fact, I tell the story that Bannister's files got ransacked as soon as he died. And the wife, however, didn't have the actual files, his widow, but she had the listing, the names of what the files were. And originally, it was written that she donated it to a library. Actually, the library bought it from her. And they were just hanging around there in New Orleans, and somebody went ahead and found it, who was doing a book on Garrison at the time. They found that whole list and they published it. And right smack in the middle of it was this program called Dinosaur. And what Bannister had written next to it was Space Warcraft. Well, that's very interesting because Blue Gemini and Dinosaur, which replaced Blue Gemini, were intended as science gathering space probes. So Warcraft is very different. And right underneath that, if you look at Bannister's list, is the JFK assassination. The links around these two are crucial. They've been ignored too long. But what we can do, I think, with this 60-year anniversary is really open it up. And so much gets opened up by this court case. So let's take a look at some of the players here. And I'm going to go right for Byrd, in fact. But one of the things that's interesting about D.H. Byrd, who was a very, he was a millionaire, but he was unsuccessful on the oil front, but he was very good as a military defense contractor. And so they used the DH to call him Dry Hole Byrd. But his cousin, of course, was going off to Antarctica over and over again on these missions. And guess who was funding all that? It was D.H. Byrd. And Byrd is fascinating in American history for a number of reasons. One of the reasons is that he founded Civil Air Patrol. And of course, the units that were founded that he visited, held figures like Lee Harvey Oswald and David Ferry, for example. This is someone who is a real power player right in the middle. And interestingly enough, I was just reading a letter that his cousin Harry Byrd, Senator Harry Byrd, in 1948, sent to Congress saying that the paperclip Nazi program needed to be implemented. We needed that advantage. And there's some major Nazi kind of flag waving in the middle of all this. But here was, this kind of someone who was aspiring as part of that geologist club in Dallas to be in with the biggest of the big, Clint Murchison. But it's interesting, if you go through his history, you're going to find some interesting things about Dry Hole Byrd. One of the things we're going to find is that one of his employees was George de Mohrenschildt. Now, de Mohrenschildt is a very interesting George de Mohrenschildt, this character who shows up as an oil geologist, millionaire, hanging out with Oswald when he comes back from the Soviet Union. There's a number of things that happened in de Mohrenschildt's story that are fascinating. I'm going to get to them. But let's keep in mind the thread here of Byrd and de Mohrenschildt, because it's going to be important. As a matter of fact, there was a cystic fibrosis charity that was founded, interestingly enough, by Byrd's wife, and on the board was George de Mohrenschildt. So we have instantly now the owner of the Texas Schoolbook Depository, Dryhold Byrd, and this is a very conspicuous honor, who is someone who is a major fundraiser for LBJ. And of course, he founded the Civil Air Patrol. Oswald comes out of that, comes to Dallas. Boom, he has this job 6 weeks before the assassination, stacking books for $1.25 an hour. And then de Mohrenschildt, who's been guiding Oswald all the way, is the one who sort of makes all this happen. And then when we think of these connections of Byrd, de Mohrenschildt, and Oswald, we can see when Oswald walks into work every day, he is in the middle of a cabal. And the cabal represents advanced technology, Texas oil money, and the Central Intelligence Agency, which Oswald had been working for since his inception into the military at age 17. And of course, when he was 15, he was in the Civil Air Patrol. So how early did that training of Oswald occur? These figures all showing up in a row give us some rather explosive details to work with. Yeah, you had something?
I just wanted to ask, usually a geologist would not be a millionaire. He wouldn't be able to make $1 million in his lifetime. Did he inherit?
Well, oil geologists were heavily in demand.
Okay.
And there is a book about George de Mohrenschildt called Our Man in Haiti, which gives a really good outline. It's by Joan Mellon. And it gives us this idea that he comes out of this White Russian aspect coming out of Russia and really opposing the current regime at the time. So in America, there's a whole group of them. This White Russian community who want to see the Soviets ousted. And it's very interesting because he's turned down for work in the OSS originally back in the 40s for having been hired by Nazis and being a Nazi sympathizer, things of this nature. He's also unusual in that he'll say, oh, I want to go for a walking tour in this country. And he'll show up. And then as he's doing the walk, the country's leader is being overthrown. So he's kind of a major bellwether for intelligence activities, but hired by a number of different groups, not just the CIA. There's this whole piece of kind of post-Nazi intelligence that gets involved in our CIA, but they also operate independently. And that's the whole Galen network, which adopts itself directly into our own CIA. That's where some of the problems start with this extra constitutional agency. So we'll keep going here with Byrd. I said that he founded the Civil Air Patrol. Well, it's interesting because the June before the JFK assassination, he's given the Lifetime Achievement Award by the Air Force for founding the Civil Air Patrol. And so he is already somebody who's well recognized inside of this system. But one of the unusual things is that his cousin has named a number of landmarks in Antarctica after him, including D.H. Byrd Mountain. Now, we have these connections with Byrd and a few interesting things about his ownership of the Texas Schoolbook Depository. One of the interesting pieces of information is that, in fact, the Texas Schoolbook Depository, just a few months before the assassination, was empty. And it's interesting. Later, there's a movie that comes out in the 1970s called Winter Kills. And it's all about an alternate version of the Kennedy assassination. And one of the things that they do is they hide the actual assault rifle inside the building, the rifle that does the assassination. And then later it gets discovered and all of these things happen. But it's interesting to me because having that much control over the building means you could have prepped and laid out you could have had the assassins in there training while the building was empty. So this thing could have gone back. They may have been planning what they were doing for quite a while. So when the Texas School Book Depository rents the building and leases it from D.H. Byrd, in fact, for years it was known under a different name, and it was only for a very short period of time that it had this title of the Texas School Book Depository. It was called the Sexton Plant, and that's the original picture of it in 1938. And you can see, the famous window is going to be up there. That window is going to be significant in this story beyond just the idea that Oswald was shooting out of it, which, of course, anyone who's done deep research knows that Oswald wasn't on the sixth floor, and that the people, the two witnesses who were the secretaries who worked on the fourth floor, when they left, Oswald would have had to have been running out of the building, running down the stairs by them, in fact. They never saw him. And what happened was basically the Warren Commission, the officials, and all those people just said, disappear. This is on the 50th anniversary of the JFK assassination. People had showed up there to, pay homage to it. It's still that incredible mystery. Many people just don't understand what was taking place there. We're going to try to unravel that tonight by showing the connections between the groups who are controlling things on the ground and what their sources were, where their roots were, where their connections were. Antarctica plays very largely into this, strangely enough, as do the Nazis and the UFO file. Now, it's no shock to an X series viewer, but nonetheless, this in concert with this court document I'm going to read tonight really opens things up dramatically and may change the trajectory of our understanding of all of it. Everyone, you're watching the JFK Assassination Breakthrough. This is X Series 55, X, Byrd, Antarctica, Nazis, and the UFO file. We're going to be taking your questions in the second part of tonight's broadcast. It's great to be here with you now in September and rolling forward into a raging close of the 2023 year and the setup for the 2024 election, which is going to be massive.
Mm-hmm.
How are you doing out there?
Good. I wanted to mention this earlier. You were talking about the fall, and when I was meditating before the show, the word passion came to me. And I there's something about everybody finally choosing to live it with passion versus fear.
Well, it's interesting because when they rolled out this idea, and Alex Jones actually got this intel early, that they were going to try the whole COVID thing again. And I think, it was quite fascinating because that is a way to diffuse something when the information comes out early, and then they almost look stupid going through the motions. But it was my impression really that they were raising those restrictions again to kind of take the pulse of the public. And I think that instantly they realized the public wouldn't go for it. Some people, and this is part of the lay of the land for 2024, but people in the media from all stripes, on the left side, they're really pushing for the Civil War idea and against any kind of Trump presidency, things of this nature. It doesn't matter where you stand in politics, just the strange nature of this, why they so hell-bent on keeping Trump out. It's interesting. But then on the other side of things, you have Tucker Carlson saying, no, they're going to do the Russian war, but they're going to do it with boots on the ground. It's going to be a hot war. That's how they're going to seize quote unquote emergency powers. So people are coming at this and into it from different levels. What we've put on the record is that their best bet, in my opinion, for emergency powers is a UFO threat. And they may have cyber defense systems. They may have a nuclear incident, whatever it is. War certainly would give them some of those abilities. But the UFO file is unique in that they've been prepping for a while, and that you can tell that their plans are reaching some kind of crescendo because of the amount of information coming out from the government, misleading though it is, relating directly to the UFO file, and the amount of stooges that they're trying to roll out there to get it to stick. Can they make the traction happen? It tells me that we're very close. I've talked about that atomic clock, that the doomsday clock, as they've used it, And these scientists get together and say, like, well, we're 1/2 second closer towards doomsday. And they move the clock up a little bit. I say on the UFO threat, um, blue beam style scenario, they've moved that clock dramatically this year. And that's because we saw the NORAD commander and all these people involved with the phony UFO shoot down Chinese balloon across America. That stuff tells you that they're much closer to using it. So, but yeah, when you said that, it made me instantly think of the COVID part.
Mm-hmm.
And speaking of that, this is interesting. Someone in the Trump side is catching on. Trump blasts new mask mandates. We will not comply. That sounds like the Trump who was trying to promote hydroxychloroquine when they were pushing him on the vaccine part. That was the guy who, he was pushing ivermectin and other things. And it's interesting because they demolished him in the media over that. And Trump went into this whole thing about Operation Warp Speed and all that, thinking he was going to get elected probably. But in any case, I think the light bulb has gone off in there. And now we have Trump talking, we will not comply. That's good. That's good. And he was never pro lockdown. I'll give him credit for that. All right. So we're going to keep some dates in mind here. I was talking about the Texas Schoolbook Depository window from which allegedly the shots were fired. Now we know that President Kennedy, the shots that killed him were from the front, in fact, and there was shooting from the rear from two different buildings locations, but the actual kill shot came from the front. Now, the amount of bullets involved were much bigger. The Warren Commission, their whole case was a whitewash, as we know. But here's a little bit from the Dallas Morning News, famed Oswald window, and it's from 2006. They congregate here almost every day at Dealey Plaza, pointing, squinting, and photographing that window. Hundreds of thousands annually from all over the world want to get a personal memento of that tragic day in November. It was right here, young tourists from Japan said. So they go on with this setup. Then it says, what sort of presence emanates from that building, now the home of Dallas County government? Its top floors are a museum. It isn't because that is the window. The window that today just picks the spot where Lee Harvey Oswald sat poised with his cheap Mannlicher Carcano rifle on November 22nd, 1963 is not the same one Oswald leaned against to line up the deadly shots that killed President Kennedy. All right, that's totally fake. Ferris Rookstole, a former FBI employee, said when he got word new windows were going to be installed, he contacted Dallas County officials. County had since bought the building from Dryhole Byrd and was told he could have them all if he would pay to have them hauled away. Aware that some of the windows had been switched over the years, Mr. Rookstole ordered his workers to gather the windows from the building and deliver them to a Dallas warehouse. I thought I had them all. We could determine later scientifically which was the specific one. That's what this guy supposedly was thinking. But as the story goes along, the Byrd family had been assured that the Oswald window had been removed before this person had come in and bought it. So there's someone named Mayhew in this story as well. Mr. Mayhew isn't talking. He did not return phone calls seeking comment. But interestingly enough, the story goes that D.H. Byrd had the window removed and displayed at his home. And when he released his own autobiography called I'm an Endangered Species, a Capitalist, he had the celebration and invited the press and everybody on November 21st, which would have been a day shy of the 15th anniversary of the Kennedy assassination. And as they walked in, there it was, right in the middle of the living room, the window from where Lee Harvey Oswald had allegedly shot President Kennedy. Of course, Oswald was never at that window, as we know. But this is rather fascinating about the setup of all of it. And there was, for this promotion, also a reenactment at the Texas Schoolbook Depository by Byrd holding the rifle out the
Oh my
window.
God.
And there's a television story, a report of this. I've seen it on multiple occasions. But this is the strange attraction and also the magical object piece that when we get into this, it's very interesting. I go back to Rudolf Hess and Himmler, and they would hold these ceremonies in this castle. And what they would do is they would take the skulls of these SS heroes and put them in circles and use them as magical objects. This is the type of thing you can feel them doing in relation to the Texas School Book Depository. In fact, one of the weirdest stories about them digging up the remains of Lee Harvey Oswald, because the wife didn't actually believe that was him in there, is that the person who had put him, Paul Grudy, who had done the work on him originally, said, wait a minute, this isn't the same head. Only the body's the same, but the head has a scar from an autopsy that's not there. And they were basically like, shut up. And it does not surprise me that they would take the magical artifact of Oswald's head and probably use it in some ritual. But this is very interesting about the window, and the window is going to become important, even more important as we get along in this story. But it has been widely reported that this whole thing is out there. And it's very interesting to me, too, because somebody like our friend Byrd, who owned the building, after all, for many decades and only leased it out, the fact that the Texas School Book Depository, as it would become in history, really wasn't even the name of the building. It was just a short-term contract that had been adopted into this building, is something for us to keep in mind. Then the other piece that we want to keep in mind is that Byrd, promoting his cousin, paying for his cousin's excavations and explorations of Antarctica. And we're going to get into the Antarctica piece with Colonel Byrd in a moment. But I want to keep going down this track and bring us over to his other cousin, Senator Harry Byrd of Virginia, who was a major coordinator and held the purse strings for NASA, along with LBJ. Now, there's a very interesting set of pictures of LBJ as president meeting Senator Byrd. One of those pictures that I've always found rather remarkable was this one, because you feel like someone is kissing the hand of the mafia boss. But here is the president kissing the hand of Senator Byrd. I think a picture says 1,000 words. Can you imagine that?
I saw that picture earlier. I didn't know who it was. And I was like, that's not the Pope. That's what it feels like.
I tweeted it out. Yeah, it is quite remarkable. Now, let's remember this about Senator Byrd, if we don't remember anything else. He was, as I said, he held the purse strings for NASA. Nothing happened in terms of aerospace without his committee. 2, he's also the person in 1948 who wrote the letter to Congress saying, you have to back this paperclip program. Don't even think about it. We need it. Now, it's very interesting because one of the people who was very hostile to Byrd, Senator Byrd, was President Truman. President Truman was against the idea of paperclip at first, especially. Later, in his comments and conversations with Kennedy, he's almost warning him about the intelligence agency. He seems to be sensing something is afoot. Kennedy gets assassinated, and Truman writes a major editorial in the Washington Post in their second edition. And no, in the first edition, I'm sorry, because they had 2 editions in those days. And by the second edition, they've pulled it out because the CIA is freaked out. But it was we need to end the CIA, or, either recreate it or end it. And it was never meant to be this. But when you think of Truman passing the presidency and knowing after the Kennedy assassination that this had happened, his letter becomes very significant. Like the work that we see in the speech of Eisenhower when he's leaving office, he did a lot so that the people on the intelligence side and in the State Department who were watching his speech were reading a different speech and were freaked out when he said, we need to understand and prevent this abuse by the military-industrial complex. That wasn't in the speech. that they were given as copies. And that's very important. President Kennedy pulled the same thing to get around the intelligence agencies and the State Department with his speech at American University in June of 1963, which is called the most articulate speech for peace ever given in American politics. And what he says is that, the Russians are people too. We all share the same planet. So let's find a way not to fight a nuclear war where even the fruits of victory would be ashes in our mouth. This is very important, the way that these things are worded and the way that they're done. And if you go into the history around it, they always involve getting out of the bureaucracy and getting out of the machine, because the machine, even then, was controlled by this incredibly burgeoning military and scientific complex, which were sitting in the middle as the heavy oppression of, in this period. We have definitely had this thread through time, and these people saw it coming. That's what is important for us to keep in mind there. It's great to have so many of you here with us. Let's keep going now down this track and start to think about, we've got a few things on Byrd here. Now I'm going to bring in the first part of the case. As I said, there's a court case out there which gets into Byrd and gets into some very interesting people that he had visiting him at the time of the Kennedy assassination, including someone who was very closely associated with the Hitler regime and the Nazis. This gets very interesting, and we're going to put ourselves now in Mozambique. And we're over there with some hunters, and these hunters have very interesting backgrounds. One of them in particular was known for his very incredible ability as an assassin. He was called Dram. That was his intel code name, DRAM. And I'm going to reveal exactly who he is, how he relates to all these things. But this is the picture of Dram, and this is the subject of the court case, in fact, that we're speaking of. The actual name of the person you're looking at is Werner von Alvensleben, and his code name was Dram. I'm going to refer to him as Dram to keep in the spirit of the work that he was doing. This individual, Dram, in fact, visited in 1963 and spent time at D.H. Byrd's ranch in Dallas, Texas. Now,
under what pretext?
Well, he actually had a club safari of hunters. Interestingly enough, the CIA, when they went offshore in the 70s during some of their really heavy duty, the investigations that were going on against them, they formed something called the Safari Club. I couldn't help but think of that. That was the name of his club. And interestingly enough, Dram was the person who could train all these people to hunt and all the rest. And D.H. Byrd loved to be a big game hunter, and there are all these pictures of him, with dead tigers and stuff. Dram, it's a very, very deep wandering road of him with Byrd and leading up to his association around the Kennedy assassination. Now, some people who would look into his record might suggest that he actually had already left Dallas. I don't actually suggest at his age that he was the assassin, but he was somebody who knew how to coordinate the program. And there are pictures of him and D.H. Byrd, who also left the area to go to Mozambique with Dram in Africa on December 7th in 1963, celebrating in Africa, supposedly for their big game kills. But this gets very interesting because there's a relative of Dram who's a very popular photographer, and he will show these pictures of Dram. One of the things that he shows is a picture that said, this animal was killed by D.H. Byrd, December 7th, 1963. And what he wrote as the tagline for it was "An alibi?" question mark. I found that very
Wow.
interesting. So the relative is sort of diming on him there. But this is going to get extraordinary when we think about the past. Here's what I want to point out is leading up to the 60th anniversary, we're doing a number of shows relating to what we've called Blue, which is the secret space program under Kennedy. And I have a number of things that are going to come forward in relation to that. This setup, which also involves the International Geophysical Year, Lloyd Berkner, who Kennedy was going to meet, the scientist, at the Trade Mart the day he was assassinated, and the UFO connections to all that. All these things are coming into these episodes, and it's going to stretch over about 4 or 5 episodes. So anything we don't get into in the background of DRAM tonight, we're going to be getting into in the course of these following 4 episodes. So anything that you don't hear tonight, don't worry, it's coming. Everyone, that's the Dark Journalist Show. JFK Assassination Breakthrough, Byrd Antarctica, Nazis in the UFO file. We're going to be taking your questions in the second half of the program. Let's see where we're at. Well, say in about a half hour or so. Miss Olivia, how are you doing out there?
Good. There's some questions about the Safari Club. Jimmy Lyle Kennemer says, DJ, could the Safari Club be a front for the CIA? And Rehoboth Farms says, I was researching the Safari Club this week. It's named after Adnan Khashoggi's place in Kenya. How funny.
Yeah, it's interesting. So let's separate out the two. The thing that he ran had the same name, but it was literal safari people. Later, this thing comes up in the 70s after a lot of people like Richard Helms are thrown or pushed out of office by Nixon. And they have these unusual titles, like ambassador to Iran before the Ayatollah, and fomenting unrest in different ways. So they're offshoring the black aspect of the intelligence agencies temporarily while they're under so much heat for assassinations and then assassinating President Kennedy and maybe Martin Luther King. That was the thing that was being studied in the 70s through a series of committees. And it's interesting, too, because the Nazi part came up, and I found a subcommittee that was studying paperclip. I'd never even, in all the different work, of course, I've seen all the analysis on paperclip in the 70s, but a subcommittee that was studying it, that I hadn't heard about. That was new. And I think that they've kind of kept that out of the record books. Interesting though it is. One of the things I want us to keep in mind about Byrd is who his benefactor was. And his benefactor, seen in this picture, in that corner, you can get a shot there, is all the way over here. That's LBJ at a baseball game with his big fundraiser, and the two of them together. So now think about this. Lee Harvey Oswald, when he walks into the building in order to go to work that day and be held as the patsy, he's going to work not only for someone who's in charge of an experimental aerospace company, but he's also there as somebody who is one of the big LBJ contributors and also very close friends with them. And so he's also walking into a building where the cousin of the owner is the person who basically did the most famous explorations of Antarctica, and that is Colonel Byrd. So keep all those things in mind as we move along here. One of the things that I want to cite, and this gets us directly into the Hitler aspect of this, and I want to say that when you get into the UFO file that the Nazis had, that there is a spirit, a mythological spirit, that is being translated through the Nazis directly to have that kind of domination from space over things on the ground. It shows up over and over again. It's why they were so deeply invested in the idea of their rocket program, which is why they were so advanced on that front. The mythology that the Nazis had was something about ice retreating before us. So them coming in with this kind of occult heat and melting the ice. This is an Antarctica reference. And of course, the Nazis were obsessed with it. And the person that they got to train them to go was Admiral Byrd. So there's a Nazi crossover here in terms of information connections. The person who was Dram's father, in fact, had the same name. So it makes Dram Jr. This is Senior. Senior was a political advisor, and he had run afoul after initially supporting Hitler. He ran afoul of Hitler in 1934 and was imprisoned, and everyone thought he was going to die, but something interesting happened. Hitler spared him after 4 months and said, you know what? Go right back to your regular life. And we don't know exactly what transpired there. But interestingly enough, Dram, pro-Nazi, used by the Nazis in assassination since 1933, the father runs afoul. There's even a speech that Hitler gives where he invokes him as a traitor, but only sees him in prison for 4 months and then lets him back out. Something very strange in relation to Dram and his background. But then if you go further, you start to realize that Dram, his family, goes all the way back into German aristocracy, so that you can find his family as far back as 1260 being the central core driving force in German life. So we're looking at somebody whose background instantly invokes the kind of, foggy mists of the knighthood that the Nazis sought to be with the Third Reich. Keep that in mind. It's going to come in handy as we move along here. These are pictures that are in the archives of this relative of Dram. And it was hard to figure out if this was his nephew or son. I'm still detecting that. But here's the picture where he has the little announcement on the bottom. So the picture says, shot by Harold Byrd, December 7th, 1963. And it's a picture of these hunters holding up the ear of the animal. But interestingly, on the bottom, and this comes directly from his own website, Colonel Byrd's trophy picture, an alibi? Question mark. There it is in black and white. And there it is on the bottom. I might tweet this picture out as well.
Is that an elephant?
It is, yeah. And there's a lot of, unfortunately, if you're sensitive to this around animals, and I can appreciate it, whenever you're looking into these hunters, you're going to see them, doing all these game pictures. And Byrd loves doing this. He loves being there with the rifle over the tiger, that kind of thing. This is another shot of Alvin Sleben, and it's just him there in the wilds. And this is the person that D.H. Byrd took over from Mozambique early in the year of 1963, and he stayed with him all the way until sometime around the JFK assassination, and they decided, you know what, we're going to Mozambique, and we're going to hunt together. This is the arrival of Colonel Byrd from his hunting expedition. On one of the days to come, John F. Kennedy will be shot from his building in Dallas, Texas. The official story is that he and Dram go to Mozambique just before the Kennedy assassination. Did they, in fact, with his incredible expertise as an assassin from the Nazis all the way through the 30s, and then switching sides through the OSS, and then to the CIA, which brings us into this court case, is this what we're looking at? Were these the people who devised the assassination? Here's the guy that the shots, the building came from, and he's going to hang out with the person who he's just brought over to America. Now they're going back to Mozambique. The hunter, former Nazi, Werner von Sleben, Alvin Sleben. This gets us into deep territory, as you can tell. And it's good to remember here that basically what you have in the Byrds is a heavy-duty power-broking family from Virginia. And there's a whole Byrd machine and how they control this political machine. These Byrds, the cousin, the D.H. Byrd's part, they seem to rule in Texas, Louisiana, and all the rest. And they invest themselves, starting in the 1930s, in aerospace and planes and war munitions, things of this nature. and more their fortune builds. And in fact, as I mentioned, he is supporting Admiral Byrd, his cousin, in all of these Antarctic expeditions, so much to the point that he has his own mountain named after him. That's quite remarkable in terms of a bio in any case. But now we're tying in DRAM to all this. And this is where things get very, very interesting, because the trail seems to be from Nazis to OSS to the CIA to Byrd and the JFK assassination. It's one heck of a trajectory. In fact, DRAM will live all the way until 1998. It's a long life, 35 years longer than President Kennedy's, interestingly enough. And his expertise around assassination would make him an ideal, and I mean quite an ideal, choice on the part of Byrd. But let's go further still, because remember, we have Byrd connected with George de Mohrenschildt, and de Mohrenschildt ends up dead after all.
By a gunshot.
Exactly.
Can I throw something in for a second?
Yeah. Oh, yes, please.
THP3 Free says Kathy O'Brien has said that Senator Byrd was part of the CIA sex trafficking network. And Robert Scott said, were the Byrds tied in with Hughes aircraft at all?
Yeah, this is another Byrd, Senator Byrd, who is the mentor. He was a KKK guy originally. He's the mentor for Hillary Clinton. He's also one of the oldest senators before he died. But that is he's part of that strain of it, but he's not related to these Byrds. He not directly related to the story of these Byrds that we're talking about, although he is Senator Byrd in Virginia. What was the second part of that?
Are the Byrds related to Hughes aircraft at all?
Yes. There is a crisscross in the financial strings that Harry Byrd is letting out for aerospace, and also the deal that Nixon swings. Nixon tried to get into the good graces of Byrd, but Nixon swings this incredible deal with Howard Hughes Aerospace. And what he says is, look, I will let you make it a charity, a medical charity, which means you won't get taxed. And you can run hangars of your best fighters, and all the stuff, the satellites you're going to send into space. You can do it all tax-free. How do you like that? And that's the deal that they made. And as a result of that, all this money from Hughes poured into the Nixon campaign. Interestingly enough, Robert Kennedy communicated to an aide, John Meyer of Howard Hughes, that he knew about the deal and would expose it in the 1968 campaign. I have him on the record in my documentary, X-Protect, the UFO File Assassins. And he's still there in Canada. He's an older man with a great story, and how he was kind of chased all over the world. But John Meyer was one of the top assistants to Howard Hughes. And so, yes, I guess would be the short answer for that one. Okay, de Mohrenschildt's a little more on that. De Mohrenschildt's a very cultured man. This is another oddity around him with Oswald. And for him to adopt such an interest, he will actually say and put on the record later that it was a CIA operative who came to him and said, keep an eye on Oswald. This is how he put it, to keep tabs on him. And so de Mohrenschildt was hanging out with him. He was bringing clothes over for his wife and things of this nature. After Oswald was killed himself in the middle of all this, it seems to be that de Mohrenschildt suffered some kind of pangs of conscience later and would give interviews where he said, he was an incredibly kind, loving person, Oswald, which is unusual if you're also the person who linchpinned him in the Warren Commission report as the person who assassinated the president. So he's a complex character here, but his involvement with all sorts of different government entities and presence as an oil geologist, interestingly enough, we know on the record, and I've put this in a couple of my own documentaries, that he was close friends with George Herbert Walker Bush Sr. And this is interesting because when Sr. becomes the CIA director, a lot of weird things happen. because de Mohrenschildt, at this point, the Kennedy investigations are coming up again, and de Mohrenschildt's name is being floated around, and he writes a letter to George Bush, and he says this to him, and Bush is the CIA director at the time, and he says to him, I'm writing you this because I wonder if you could kind of save me from this gauntlet of people. I'm followed everywhere. My phone is tapped. I don't know who they are, but I try to write foolishly about Lee Harvey Oswald and must have really angered some people. You have to get me out of this. So the letter comes in, and a number of people in like the secretaries and stuff see the letter. So it's not something that Bush can bury. So for some reason, he goes on the record. And so the story goes, and this is in USA Today, actually. Mr. Bush, do you know this individual? A CIA secretary wrote on a note to the then CIA director, Bush. Bush responded, I do know this man de Mohrenschildt. Bush wrote an internal CIA note. I first met him in the early 40s. He was an uncle to my Andover roommate. Later, he surfaced in Dallas in the 50s, maybe. He got involved with some controversial dealings in Haiti, Bush continued. Then he surfaced when Oswald shot to prominence. He knew Oswald before the assassination of President Kennedy, I guess. Yeah, I'm sure. I don't recall his role in all this, Bush continued. At one time, he had or spent plenty of money. I've not heard from him for many years until the attached letter came in. Another CIA file said de Mohrenschildt had been acquainted with First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy's father, John Bouvier, and his mother, Hugh Auchincloss, since Mrs. Kennedy was a little girl. As detailed in February 24th, 1964, FBI report interviewed his former wives, business associates, and social contacts to provide an entertaining, gossip-filled look at de Mohrenschildt's life. And so on it goes. But here's the connection here. And the fact that he had an association with Jackie's parents shows him as somebody who's kind of interloping intelligence agent that will sell his services to a number of different people. But he's also right there in the middle of the action. But he's friends with Bush. He's part of this oil geology club where only the best of the best are in it. And in that club, we have Dryhole, Byrd, de Mohrenschildt, and Clint Murchison and others at a really incredibly high level. When it comes to the Kennedy assassination, so many of these people surface to one degree or another. But interestingly enough, the thing that is not often taken into consideration is the fascist Nazi connection element in all of this, which is sitting right there in figures like de Mohrenschildt, in figures like Bush, and in figures like General Galen. So this becomes important for us to keep in mind when we're dealing with de Mohrenschildt and then the close association that he has with Byrd. And Byrd's going to become even more important as the story goes along. I want to take us back momentarily. This, by the way, is a shot of Dram during the time when he was a top Nazi assassin. So when they would have problems in certain countries, certain areas, to send this guy in as a sniper, get rid of that leader, get rid of this person who's against us. And this is early on, starting through Himmler in 1933. And on the record, I'm going to read his file from the OSS here shortly. This is our assassin, Dram, during his Nazi period. And take that period, 1933, and add 30 years to 1963, and find him closely associated with the person who owns the Texas School Book Depository and in Dallas for many months just before the assassination at the behest of Dryhole D.H. David H. Byrd. One of the interesting things, and I mentioned his background, and I promise in a future episode to go very deeply into this aristocratic family that he's from, is here is his great ancestor, Werner. There are so many interesting pieces associated with this and his presence in the middle of all this. And I'm going to save that for a separate episode. But I guarantee you, when you hear about this family, you can see perhaps why they were using him because of the depth of the network there. Here's an interesting side note, and it also comes up in the case, which is why I'm going to bring it up. As it turns out, one of his favorite rifles to use when hunting was a Mannlicher Schonauer. And here's a little bit about it. The 6.5 Mannlicher Schonauer cartridge was adopted by the Greek army along with the Mannlicher rifle in 1903. From 1906 until the German invasion and capitulation of Greece in April 1941. It was also the standard military cartridge of the Greek army. The Mannlicher Carcano round was also used by Greek forces in this rifle, being with its cartridge just 2 millimeters smaller than the desired bullet. During the German occupation, it was used by Greek resistance fighters during the Greek Civil War. During the German occupation, Carcano rifles captured during World War II were also converted to 6.5 Mannlicher Schonauer and used by Greek forces. There's a significance to this, which is now we have the hunter, and his favorite rifle is a rifle that can be used with the same type of precision of the Carcano. And again, the Carcano is not known as a very good rifle, but it's very interesting as a crossover that this is the type of rifle that he likes to use, and that it's the ammo that is the thing that is the switch out between the two. So you can actually use the ammo in a Mannlicher Carcano or in this Schonauer.
It's pretty damn suspicious.
It's very, very odd. My goodness. So now we have this African hunter, ex-Nazi. This is his lair, by the way. I thought this was kind of a telling shot too. Just take a look at that. That's the Safari Club, everyone. So we have him sitting in the middle of this situation, and we have some other figures hanging out with him. Now, let's read the report. Now, this got released through the recent JFK Records Release Act. And someone, I'm going to describe their actual court case, but first, the file that got released. And it's an OSS X2 report on Werner von Alvensleben, a.k.a. DRAM. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. This is JFK Assassination Breakthrough. Byrd Antarctica Nazis and the UFO file. Is this a multi-part episode? You bet it's a multi-part episode. Mm-hmm. But it goes along with our plans of opening up the International Geophysical Year and the Robertson Panel, Lloyd Berkner, JFK Assassination, and the SSP Blue. These episodes are all going to stream together here over the 5. And it's interesting because Olivia can tell you I was working on a Gurdjieff episode, and tonight we were going to have a Gurdjieff episode, but the urgency of the court case and everything else had me release this a little early, as I think you're going to see why. Okay, here's the report of the OSS on Alvensleben. You ready? Here we go. Werner Alvensleben, code name DRAM, all in caps. World War II double agent. Dallas Morning News, December 1963. D.H. Byrd just returned from a safari in Africa run by Werner Alvensleben, who ran Safarilandia Safari Company or Safari Club in Mozambique. Werner Alvensleben traveled to Dallas in December 1963 as a guest of D.H. Byrd. Werner von Alvensleben's favorite rifle was a big game rifle called the Mannlicher Schonauer, a Greek version of the Mannlicher Carcano rifle. There's a document that says the U.S. contracted Western Cartridge Company to manufacture Mannlicher ammunition for the Greek Civil War after the World War II, and a report that Western Cartridge manufactured ammunition from the Greek Civil War that was interchangeable between the Mannlicher Carcano and the Mannlicher Schonauer rifles. So you have a certain set of ammunition. You can use them in either version of the Mannlicher. Now, here's the actual document. Secret. This is what they released. September 28th, 1945. Subject, Baron Werner von Alvensleben. Now, they refer to him as Baron because of this background with this incredible aristocratic German family. Following information is taken from statements reportedly made by the subject himself. I was born April 23rd, 1913, in Berlin, the son of Baron Werner von Elvenschleben, captain in the German Imperial Army and former German ambassador to Tsarist Russia. 6'1", tall, slim build, light brown hair, blue eyes, pronounced scar from lobe on the left ear point of his chin. Subject: he joined Bavarian military police in Munich in 1932 at the age of 19, the rank of cadet. One statement declares he never was a member of the Nazi Party, but another statement says he joined the Nazi front at about the same time he joined the Bavarian police. This is somebody who likes to keep his hand in many camps. He took active part as a member of the police in the street fighting that took place in 32 and 33 between the Nazis and their adversaries, being wounded on one occasion. He was given the task of sabotaging vital installations at the Tyrol border district by Himmler himself, then the head of the Bavarian military police. Very early Nazi activity. He was tried and arrested by the Austrian police, found guilty on charges of being an accessory before the fact in the attempt to assassinate Dr. Stetiel. This was a prominent person who was outspoken against the Nazis. Being concerned in certain attempts to destroy government property, subject was sentenced to 3 years imprisonment in political prison. An officer taking one statement from the subject says the subject admitted in confidence but declined to sign an admission that he'd been sent to Austria with definite instructions to carry out the assassination of Style. Now, they go on further to describe his illustrious career of becoming an assassin through the 30s. And then it's a very in-depth and interesting history, which I'm going to basically summarize it this way. There's a certain point during World War II where they realize on the Allied side that they can use this guy and that he has a kind of a bendable quality. So they convert him into an OSS agent spying on the Nazis. And the question is, was he ever actually converted, or was he playing all sides against the middle, as it were? But in any case, he is the person, because of his long track record of assassination for the Nazi Party, who would have been an ideal candidate for Byrd, who was looking for an assassin to cut down President Kennedy. This would have been an ideal choice. And when we get to Byrd, of course, not being the mastermind of the assassination or anything of the sort, but he is a very important piece that lets us know of the forces behind, that kind of pinpoint. If we can see through him to the forces behind him, what is it that we're looking at? Well, Byrd, of course, instantly his funding of the Antarctica projects. 1, the explorations by his cousin. 2, the fact that he's not a very good oil man, but he's very close to all that group of oil people through the Oil Geologists Club, including de Mohrenschildt, Bush, and some of the real heavy-duty people. Now, including H.L. Hunt. Now, the key part, I think, when we're looking at Byrd is this, that Harry Byrd, his cousin, was very connected with the funding for aerospace. Then he funds himself a completely destitute experimental aerospace company, which wanted to use different means of propulsion. So he invests all this money just before 1960 into this company. And there's a whole write-up about it. And what's interesting is it comes in from a number of different sources. And don't worry, I'm going to get to the actual court case before we're done here as well. But I want to spend a little time on this LTV company because it's come up whether it was in relation to Byrd or in relation to Professor Peter Dale Scott, talking about the profit-taking that occurred after the assassination and how that lets you know who exactly was involved. It's pretty interesting because some of the things, when you look at the stocks, for example, in relation to 9/11, there's a number of these kind of black operations around the stock market. And when they were looked into, it would be found that a lot of the investments were made just before the incidents around airlines, around disaster preparedness, and things of this nature. But what's fascinating is that whole type of investment, which possesses the foreknowledge of something tragic that's about to happen, a deep event on a major level in U.S. history, also took place in the Kennedy assassination, but it's not often cited. Professor Scott got deep into it, and he found out all about this company called Ling Temco Vout, LTV, and the role that Byrd played in creating it. And they eventually became one of the major aerospace suppliers for the Vietnam War, which is why the $3 million that was invested by D.H. Byrd in 1960 grew into, by 1965, over $55 million, but only after the Kennedy assassination. Because after all, if you look back at that period of time, the defense spending that was going on was already locked in through Kennedy and McNamara. They'd already done this process. So, in fact, by the time you get to Kennedy's assassination, suddenly all of these aerospace profits go off the charts. This is the key aspect that's missing in the Kennedy assassination. This is the key aspect that can be brought forward in the records. And the fact of a case that is being brought now that mentions this is absolutely staggering. Everyone, we're dealing here tonight with the JFK assassination breakthrough. This is X Series 155, and you're here with Dark Journalist, and it's Byrd Antarctica, Nazis, and the UFO file. We're going to be taking your questions here momentarily. I think what I'm going to do is weave in the rest of the information that I have for you here tonight on Dram and Byrd through your questions. And also, as I said, it's going to be a multi-part series of episodes leading up to the Kennedy assassination. And this is probably going to be about 4 more episodes in relation to this one, which will take into account all of this SSP Blue. I want to remind you, especially if you're new here, to go to the darkjournalist.com website and sign up for our newsletter. That's a free newsletter, and we'll let you know the incredible shows that we have coming up for you, events, and also documentaries, all kinds of fantastic X-Series shows that we have coming your way, incredible interviews, things that'll blow your mind, and all the things that we have coming up for you, all there at the tip of your fingertips in your newsletter at darkjournalist.com. Literally takes 30 seconds to sign up. And, a lot of a lot of shows that I've signed up for anyway do all these multiple mailings so that,
It's a drag.
one of them sent me 12 in one day. I mean, come on. And so we send out the newsletter once a week, maybe twice, and basically just as information in there. Of course, we encourage you to subscribe to the website, get behind the work that we're doing. We don't have the $300 million Spotify contract where Joe Rogan can go on and talk fantasies with Jeremy Corbell about the UFO file. It have nothing to do with the subject. But if you want to subscribe, we've kept it very affordable, $60 for the whole year. And basically, we get much closer to the truth for you on the UFO file. I can guarantee that. No $300 million necessary. I'm sure it's good money, though, right? What do you got there?
Brendan Fisher says, was Dram affiliated with the Permindex outfit?
Well, it's pretty interesting because when we get into operators on his level, he's just the kind of person. One of the interesting things that Dr. Farrell had to say about the name Permindex, we know it was a fascist organization. And by the way, it was in Italy, and it was booted out of Italy, and it still had a headquarters in Montreal, Canada. There are still records there. The Blumenthal records are still up there in relation to the control of that organization, and there's still a political football. So we still don't have them. But one of the interesting things that Farrell said about Permindex is it made sense that the name, instead of this kind of, idea that, hey, we're doing these, World Trade Center shows and things of this nature and their expositions, No, what he put together was that it was a permanent index of people who were to be assassinated. So, yeah, that's the type of organization that would use somebody like Dram for sure. But I haven't, it's very early on in the research around Dram. I have some incredibly good sources now, and so we're introducing him tonight, but we're going to go even deeper. And he is at the heart of this court case. As I said, some more things are going to come out, especially if they're pressing for those records. We may find this is one of those linchpins in the records that they do not want to come out, which is the association of Byrd with our friend here. It's important to remember also when we're talking about the Nazi aspect that we are talking about X technology that the Nazis possessed. And there's no question with the Bell Project, things of that nature, that they were going into this kind of torsion of physics area, which is explosive. But even some of the musings of the idea of the Nazis and this program that they were developing for anti-gravity, once you move out of World War II and this group that controls that technology moves into South America, what happens to the technology? This has been the question. And, they released a very interesting book recently about Hans Kammler, and he was the one who we've done some shows on with Dr. Farrell relating directly to the Bell. And of course, Kammler's one of those Nazis who's had a series of different deaths and death stories, but he definitely got away to Argentina, and most likely with the Bell technology intact after, and remember, this is how secret it was, after assassinating all the scientists involved with it, who would fall into, the Allied hands under a paperclip program. Now, there's an interesting story in relation to all this, which comes from the relative of Thomas Townsend Brown. I actually talked with his daughter about this. And this is so significant. I'm just going to insert it here. So, one of the people who put the UFO file in its real, kind of who was in charge of it, the real background, the genealogy of the UFO file, that was Robert Sarbarker, the physicist. And he's largely neglected. It was interesting with the Oppenheimer movie coming out because he was right up there with Oppenheimer. And you never hear anything about him. There isn't even a Wikipedia page, as I've pointed out many times. But Sarbarker was best friends with T.T. Brown, and they both worked on these black projects. And the problem, I think, that the Defense Department and intelligence agencies had with them and why they had such difficulties was they were ex-chair people. They wanted the technology out there. As a matter of fact, T.T. Brown led for 12 years a UFO organization to spread the truth about the real UFO file. And Sarbarker in the 80s, as we know, and this may have cost him his life, he came out and said, "Wait, yeah, we did. We recovered these craft. Vannevar Bush was in charge of it for 20 years. Then von Neumann, he's giving the lineage of the whole thing. He's like, I don't know why they didn't let this out." And he said, yeah, we did find bodies inside, and they were insect-like, but they were built. Somebody built them to be like insects, to be able to pick up this inertia of what was going on when they were doing these incredible speeds. And he's like, I'm shocked that this information hasn't come out. So there's a story there about Sarbarker some morning going out to his car, and he lived right around here and in Florida, but he lived right over here by Harvard. And he goes out to his car and he puts his hands on the handle, and he gets a weird feeling, but he starts to drive, and then he feels weird. He calls his son up and says, I'm in the hospital. I don't know what it was, but when I got into the car, on the door handle, there's this weird jelly substance, and I felt sick ever since. And he would die after this incident, within a day. So there's something about Sarbarker and what he let out there at the end of his life. And he let it out to 3 different UFO researchers. So it's not a lark or whatever. The other thing that's important is a lot of times when information and documents come out, like MJ12, they're easy to pick apart. I almost think in some ways that there are real ones and then there are intel ones, and you can't really choose which ones are legit. But they managed to mention Vannevar Bush But the thing is, a lot of people, when it came to the lineage of the UFO file, didn't want to go on the record and say, well, I believe in this document or that one, because they were MJ12 documents and they weren't sure of the provenance. Now, you don't need any of that stuff. This is the interesting thing. All you need is the commentary by Sarbarker about what he went through and what he witnessed and how Oppenheimer was involved and von Braun and all the rest in this crash retrieval program with aliens and all the rest. He put it on the record already, so you don't even need MJ12 documents. It's interesting to review those things anyway, I would say. But in any case, Thomas Townsend Brown, according to his daughter, who I spent many hours with, and members of his family, talked to me about this. And one of the things that they told me was that they were sent on a mission into Nazi Germany just before it fell to get a particular scientist. Now, both of them were scientists. They were not military men, and they had a couple of military guides, but it was a dangerous, dangerous mission. But they needed to extrapolate out of this scientist information that only they knew. Now, we hear about all these things in relation to T.T. Brown, the UFO file, the Philadelphia experiment, whatever his expertise was, and I have a pretty good idea of what it was. He was necessary. It was necessary for him to go into this dangerous war zone. And so Sarbarker described the story to Brown's family, and Brown went on the record eventually with his own family, not to be told publicly about this. But anyway, the story came out, or to me anyway. And there they are, and they get sent into this mission. They are, there's all this German shelling, there's rockets dropping and everything. They get to this scientist, and they basically interrogate him, and they get the information that their superiors are looking for. And then the Nazi scientist, is removed to Canada. Years later, interestingly enough, but that just gives you a hint of that advanced technology and how desperately our government wanted it to send their two best guys in there, not knowing if they'd get them back. So they go in later. Sarbarker and Brown form this friendship where they really care about and support each other, having both been on the inside of these projects. And Brown starts to realize, I don't want to be used like this anymore, and I don't want the public to have this snow job. So he becomes part of this ex-share piece. The ex-protect people basically take the projects that he's developed, and so he just stops developing them. An interesting thing happened in 1968 that I think relates to, maybe gives us some idea of what the X technology is about. So when I bring in John Trump and the X technology, or if we talk about the UFO file, maybe this will give us some idea of what it is. So I go back to this T.T. Brown story. Here it is. There's a couple. First of all, when he was at this boarding school, which is the same one that President Trump would go to years later, he is 18 years old and he's walking his horse by the river, and an orb shows up over the river, and he sees it, and he's very nervous and curious about it. And then it comes at him full force, and his horse freaks out and he falls down. And while he's lying there on the ground, Brown experiences this whole dialogue with this thing, and it also shows him exactly what his life is going to be about and how he'll play a role in revealing this advanced X technology. So when he gets up from that, he's psychically changed, and he moves into all these scientific projects. He shows up in Cuba in 1930, and there's a huge earthquake as soon as he gets there. And he is testing, a submersible off the coast of Cuba, it's an experimental submersible. And he has to go aboard this yacht called the Caroline. And on that yacht, he meets this very unusual person. And the first thing that the guy shows him is Alice in Wonderland, the book, in this glass case. And he says, this is the original copy. So there are all these elements going on there. But deep in the back there is the story from his family about how he had developed something called the acoustic fan, which recreated the conditions of the orb that had done to him. So when somebody would walk in front of that acoustic fan, it could do a number of things, including send audio at you that would follow you around. But it could also lift you into different states of mind. One of the interesting things that he said it did was it had the same effect of showing someone their life. So it was kind of in essence, a time travel device or a time viewer. So she tells the story of being very young and being his assistant. His daughter told me this story. And he is setting up for all these generals, including Curtis LeMay and others, how this works. And she draws all these little X's on the ground for where people are to stand. So they stand in these different places. He gives the demonstration of the acoustic fan, which is a very unusual device. And there is one picture of it because he gave it in the basement, and in the deep basement. She said when we went down for the demonstration, it just kept going down, down, down underground. This was the large, extraordinary underground base they went to. And he gives the demonstration. Apparently, of the audio part of the displacement, maybe some of the futuring was involved too. Whatever it was, they instantly grabbed it. And he said to her, "Hey, you're going to Europe for vacation. Hey, don't worry about me. I'll be fine." And he takes off and goes to Eleuthera with his wife and a security detail. And the acoustic fan disappears from history, as it were. So, giving us some idea of what is going on in relation to that X technology and the underground operating that technology. We really think of them as a different group operating with different technology. And so there's that thread all the way through this, just like we're finding with Byrd and Dram and Antarctica. And with that, Miss Olivia, I have a lot more,
Okay.
but we're going to drift right into your
Okay,
questions and thread it
Johann
through.
Wolf says, "Wow, where can I learn more about that story?"
Well, you're learning it right here.
Is it written down in a book anywhere?
No, there's no book about it. It depends on which story you're talking about, but we're threading this through. For example, one of the things that we did early on with the X series is we brought forward this idea of D.H. Byrd, the Texas School Book Depository, and Admiral Byrd. Now, no one had very much interest in the Antarctica connection to D.H. Byrd. I'd never seen it anywhere for anything. So I think that the person who brought the lawsuit was familiar enough with the claims and had studied them through that when they were doing their own research for this AARC, which is an assassination research group, they have a habit of doing these suits against the CIA to try to get information. When they brought this in, I found, this is kind of like these things are coming out now. It's like the relevance factor of the X material is coming forward. It's in our face every day with Twitter and everything else. But I think that this is significant, which is symbolically, these stories are rising. But the case itself is going to reveal so much about this information. These are the things that I think are going to be important. And I have, before the night is over, I will read at least the initial outline of the court case, which comes from AARC. And there's no question that the things that are going to come out about this are extraordinary. But no, there isn't, there is this group bringing the lawsuit, and there's the work that we did bringing out Byrd and his ownership of the Texas School Book Depository being related to Admiral Byrd and the crisscross around those things. I did it. I called in Dr. Farrell, and we've done extrapolations and analysis around the whole thing, really bringing it forward. Now, I think this case is kind of a focal point. And, so this is the interesting thing about that. Yes.
Okay, let's go into Dram for a minute. So THP3 Free says, didn't the first cops into the depository building ID a different rifle?
True.
Then that was later switched to the one Oswald mail ordered?
Well, yeah, here's the interesting thing, which is Why did they have Oswald mail order? Now, in Texas, anywhere you can go in at that point and not give any name, and you could just give R. Smith or whatever, and then you can buy the rifle, and that's it. There's no ID or anything. That's the way it used to work. So there was no reason to order anything through the mail. Now, what Professor Scott did when he analyzed the relationship of FBI agent James Hosty, who plays a major role in the cover-up around the JFK assassination, and Oswald. They seem to have an unusual relationship where Oswald shows up at the FBI office and he says things like, you get him to leave my wife alone, and I'm going to write this note for him, and you give him that. And then Hosty reads the note, but what does the note really say? So Oswald's put on a good front, like, leave my wife alone. But actually the note is probably, hey, he's working on a project for him. The project that Peter Dale Scott deduced that Oswald was working on was how to track guns through the mail. This is what the FBI had given Oswald. Oswald had been used by the CIA and the FBI for these various different projects as a way to create a background, a legend for him. So later they could say, oh, he's a communist, he's an agitator, he's for Fidel, and he ordered these weapons through the mail, and that's what he killed the president with. They did the whole thing. They set it all up. But Oswald thinks, oh, I'm penetrating this operation about guns. I'm ordering things through the mail. I'm sending my reports back to Hosty, in fact. Now, what's interesting is Hosty, who got this note delivered just before the assassination from Oswald, they asked him, where's the note? And he said, I destroyed it. Why would you destroy a note from the assassin, supposedly, if you thought it was the assassin? And he said, well, he was dead and there wasn't going to be any trial, so I ripped it up and flushed it down the toilet. I mean, this is the type of answers that worked as history at that point. And later they would call him before a committee, and he knew all this information. And they said, why didn't you give that information during the Warren Commission? He said, I was not asked. This is how the intelligence agencies work it. So sometimes when I talk about the things that we experience in the UFO file, the falsification of the UFO file as a UFO threat things, a lot of these people can say, like Lou or Grush or anybody, when it comes to the UFO file, they can say, I wasn't asked. That's why it's important for them when I say, well, you can have a gentleman's debate on this program. I'll ask the question. So they can't use the excuse, I was not asked. This is the problem with the softball stuff that goes on in media land around UFOs. There's no value to it because those people, either they don't know how to ask the right questions or they have no desire to press. They just like, the fascination for clicks around the UFO file. But if you want real information on it, you're going to have to ask them real journalistic questions. And those questions are going to be very penetrating. They're not going to be like the Knapp soft shoe thing. I always do the Knapp thing when he gets around these guys. He's like, Dave, do you want to be remembered more as a hero or a legend for the American people? And and so he has this thing, and then the person is like, I'm just doing my duty because I'm a good Boy Scout. I mean, the most ridiculous dialogue you've ever heard in your life. If you had somebody on that committee that Burchett ran, instead of Burchett just sitting there being like, wow, you just said UFO, I mean, it was pretty bad. And it's pretty interesting to me too, because Grush, one of the things that came up in the Rogan story when Rogan was talking with Knapp and Corbell just yesterday, this I found very interesting, because Corbell spent all this time with Knapp talking about how it was important that McCullough was right there, and now how they had set it up so that McCullough would be there. It had got out that the reports that we'd done about McCullough, his connection to, he being somebody who was actually the protege of Clapper. If you go to the DNI website, you can see them doing that. But more important about McCullough is that he was the one who had crafted the Patriot Act. It's in his own bio. Read it. He was the one who had developed Homeland Security. He was one of the main players. That's the guy running the UFO disclosure outfit he's the chief legal spook, in fact, for the intelligence community, the IC. There you go. I mean, and so it's interesting to me, they didn't want to talk about McCullough before Knapp or Corbell because, this isn't the kind of thing that you want to bring up. But there he is sitting right in the back. We've brought it forward, and they're forced on this national program to go out there and say, we put McCullough there. It was important for him to be there because he's protecting his whistleblower friend, Grush. He's his lawyer. He should be there. Why are they even saying that? It's very interesting. So I think we struck a nerve there. And, that's what we're good at when it comes to this stuff. But when you see that type of overreaction, then, the intelligence people are like, go out and do damage control because this is a problem. And we can't resuscitate the Grush op until you get this under control. By the way, don't mention that this guy created the Patriot Act or Homeland Security. They're probably scrubbing McCullough's bio right now as we speak. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is the JFK assassination breakthrough. Byrd, Dram, Antarctica, Nazis in the UFO file. I didn't put Dram in the title because I wanted this to be really, kind of core surprise information for you here, and revealed the first piece of it we have. Next up, Miss Olivia.
Okay, so Rose is asking, is DJ saying that Dram shot the rifle or was involved in another way, such as training or advising?
No. Well, first of all, one of the things in the court case, and I will read some of the court case here, is they want the CIA's records of where Dram was. And they want to know basically what the CIA's relationship with Dram was up to that point. This is what's in the lawsuit, which I think is going to be fascinating for us to watch. I have a few other things here related to that. But one of the things I want to point out about Dram is he's so skilled at assassination that, especially in some of the Dallas Morning News articles that I've found, they have him, it says, the season is bad over in Mozambique, so D.H. Byrd had him come over. So he comes over like in the summer here, 1963, and supposedly leaves and goes back to Mozambique just before the assassination. D.H. Byrd also spirits out of town for the assassination, and they're supposedly both in Mozambique. They may very well have been, but they did this architecture. And the fact, the only thing that we need to know is that Byrd, one, owned the Texas School Book Depository. Two, he was tied in directly with the government and with the oil geologists and oil men of Texas. And then all of the CIA fingerprints and experimental aerospace fingerprints around Byrd. Then when you go a little bit deeper, you've got the cousin in Antarctica and him funding all of the activities. I mean, it's just actually a staggering set of connections for what is supposedly, the official story. Well, this guy got a job and just got lucky that 6 weeks later, the president's motorcade went by that window, and this guy just hated American system, and he was a communist, even though he worked for a right-winger just the summer before. So it's a fascinating history that's standing out there waiting to be demolished with the new facts that we have, and we need that real clear history. But there's no question that Dram here, being a Nazi assassin, is another piece in the fascist aspect involved in the Kennedy assassination that relates directly again to the paperclip program, because again, what's the heart of the paperclip scientist program? It is aerospace. And that's the crucial part here for us to keep in mind. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Rosterman the Seer, hasn't it been confirmed that the kill shot was from a storm drain ahead of the limo back to the left?
Yeah, but the building's important. The building becomes the legend. So the way that you do things in that building to place the rifle, to have the patsy, it needs to be the historical record. The storm drain shot is something that has come up that people have looked at. It looks more like the shots were just directly from the grassy knoll and from the Daltex building. But there's a crossfire effect that goes on that anyone, I think, with real training in firearms would say between 6 and 10 shots from multiple directions were shot. And that's why you got James Tague under the underpass being struck by one of the bullets. Unusual things. If the shooting supposedly was taking place from behind him, none of these things would make any sense. None of the wounds, the critical wounds to the head and the throat, but they were both frontal, so they're not from behind. This has been played out dramatically through a number of different research. Anyone who studied the Kennedy assassination for real knows that the bullets were from the front. So that's just, the other part is just the CIA myth-making media lie. And that's what you get in the mainstream media, yes.
Timothy Guessing says Harley Byrd wrote the foreword to the book on Valiant Thor's Strangers at the Pentagon. Is this yet another Byrd?
What's the name?
Harley?
Harley Byrd. We're going to have to look at that. But Stranger at the Pentagon, I think is a reasonable, and the Val Thor thing is certainly reasonable from the point of view of the Reverend Strange there. Stranges? Yeah, Frank Stranges. So, this gets us into some interesting territory because what I'm seeing is this guy tells a story about the Pentagon thinks that they have a visitor, an alien visitor from another planet, and Stranges is there, and they kind of consult him like, we have someone here who's an alien, like, and he remembers all this, and he brings out the story later about Valiant Thor saying you're going to destroy yourselves with nuclear weapons and that kind of thing. The whole thing could be a psyop, etc. But his experience, I think for sure, is real. Just like when you get into the Tall Whites story, you're looking at somebody who's telling you what happened to him. And there may well be Tall Whites, and they may be Earth, some offshoot of humans. This gets us into the territory of the automatons in Atlantis, etc. So there's a number of different things there, but if you want to just look at it from the psyop perspective, they could have these people interacting with and saying, how would this work? How do people relate if they were dealing with aliens? How would this work? And they might send in people and pretend, have them pretend to be aliens, but that doesn't mean that there aren't aliens, you see. This is why it gets to be very interesting. And it's not an easy place to navigate, but I think if our minds are open, there's a lot of information that we have that has nothing to do with the government. Tons of it. All the John Mack cases, there's no government involvement. The Betty and Barney Hill story, the actual story doesn't have anything to do with the government. They came in later and tried to massage it or get rid of it. But the tale, their experience that they came back with, it's it's a very compelling story from two people who were very solid. And so therefore you've got the story. You don't need any of the government stuff. The government at this point is a kind of a backward entity. You can't expect truth from them on big subjects, you might get, it's like the media. You can check the weather and sports and celebrity news. You're not going to get anything real from the media the way that it's set up now. Yes.
Vincent Latuca says, of course the Nazis went to Antarctica. 100 subs were missing. Connect the dots. Byrd to the death of James Forrestal in 1952 flyovers through the death of JFK all the way to the WEF.
Oh yeah, it's on the record that the Nazis went there and that they also had this vision of setting up a new Schwabenland. This was going to be one of these divine territories that they were going to conquer. So there's no question about that. And there's a number of things on the record about Hess and all the rest of it. And, the people who were involved in setting it up are actually quite an interesting mystery in and of themselves. There's more on that as well, because the person that Kennedy was going to meet at the Trade Mart in Dallas when he was assassinated is crucial. And that's Lloyd Berkner, who had been in 1929 with Admiral Byrd, and he was there as a 22-year-old radio whiz setting up radio. And there's a whole weird story about this one shortwave radio guy who figured out how to dime into the signal they were sending from Antarctica. So something very strange was going on there in this radio setup, but Berkner was right in the heart of it. Berkner had been selected, and he's somebody that I've seen always is right between X-Protect and X-Share. It seemed like he wanted to give out information, but he also worked for some of the dirtiest aspects in the government. So he's sitting there right between it. But Kennedy was going to meet Berkner, and there was a whole ceremony that was planned about them having a flag that was set over the White House. So I did a whole episode on Berkner. I have a picture of Berkner here. And remember, he headed up the Robertson panel on UFOs. But what is forgotten about him is his work with James McDonald. And what's weird is McDonald goes to meet Lloyd Berkner in 1966 and says, I have all this stuff. And for some reason, there's a Johnson aide there. And Johnson tells the aide, look, you have to get McDonald off my back. There's some weird reason why LBJ had this kind of respect for McDonald. And I still don't know quite what it is, but I'm working on it. And anyway, they all get together, this aide to LBJ, Lloyd Berkner, and James McDonald. And McDonald says, here's all this information that I have, and, around the UFO file. And by the way, they're really feeding everyone a lot of nonsense about this. Look at the things that I've found. And he'd been around. He'd already been in the game for 20 years. Berkner leaves that meeting, and he's like, he has the whole UFO Antarctica knowledge himself. And he decides that he's going to set a proposal up based on that meeting, but nobody really talks about exactly what it was that was going to happen. But he went back to Washington, D.C. He shows up at the think tank he works at. He picks up some fast food, and he dies of a heart attack right after meeting McDonald. So Berkner, being the person that JFK was going to meet, they were going to have a big press conference together. Kennedy was going to give him a flag from the White House directly, and according to Berkner's notes, they were going to announce something that was going to have staggering international implications.
Wow.
We've never found out about it. And then for years, people asked people, well, can you give us the speech that Kennedy was going to give at the trademark? And LBJ was like, oh, it's lost. And then finally they came up, they were like 3 years later, like, oh yeah, look, here's the thing. He was going to give the speech, and you read it, and it's like, we need more nuclear weapons. It's not a Kennedy speech. So whatever happened to the real speech, I have no idea, but Berkner was the one who he was going to give it with. And he was the one who had been over there in Antarctica, setting it up with Admiral Byrd. And this is going to parlay into the International Geophysical Year episodes that we're going to do, because right there in 1958 and 57, that's when they did the International Geophysical Year. And they all go back, including Byrd and everybody. They all go back to Antarctica. So I think we're getting warm in the tundra, in the frozen tundra. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Deep, deep tonight, JFK Assassination Breakthrough, DRAM, as it were, X, Byrd, Antarctica, Nazis, and the UFO file. We're going to take a few more of your questions, and then I'll read something from this court case, and then we'll call it an X night.
Okay. Rick is asking, how about LBJ? Any evidence to suggest he was in on the UFO details?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Heavily. As a matter of fact, there are all these notes that, as a senator, he's ticked off at the Robertson panel that he can't get the information. There's a few things about the Robertson panel that's important to note. They had people like Berkner and Alvarez who become major interfaces between the deep state and the advanced technology, and certain things like exploring the Great Pyramid for cosmic rays, for a hidden shaft using cosmic rays. So people like Alvarez and Berkner are very significant in a way that is very hard for us to understand now. But McDonald got the first version of the Robertson report and said it was totally different than the thing that came out. That's what gave him as a scientist, James McDonald, who became a leading UFO advocate before he supposedly bumped himself off as part of the X Protect. And those deaths are the most ridiculous. And, you know, Jessup and McDonald, they're just, systematically wiped out because of the information that they had. But it's very interesting because when you look at some of the things that were being talked about right after the Robertson panel, LBJ just getting himself into the Senate and becoming a force there, he's instantly placed in the aerospace category, and he's very big with the paperclip Nazis immediately. But he starts to write that he's ticked off that they're keeping the truth about the UFO file piece in the Robertson panel from him and from his Senate committees and things like that. By 1960, he is going to have his own version of a UFO tell-all Senate committee to investigate the whole thing. And then he becomes VP to Kennedy. All that goes away. And so there's a lot of things that were going to happen around, first of all, the International Geophysical Year, 57 to 58. Something happened there, and I'm going to lay out some of the details of that in upcoming episodes. But later, if you go into Admiral Hillenkotter and some of these other people who opened up the first levels and layers of the UFO file, they are saying, look, we're going to have a problem because with all the nuclear aspects going on, we need to have some kind of a fail-safe if a UFO flies over a nuclear silo in the Soviet Union, that it's not us. We need some kind of a piece, we need some kind of a thread set up between the two countries. Kennedy takes the same exact position that Hillenkotter puts on the record in a New York Times article in 1960. So Hillenkotter spouting Kennedy disclosure points in a New York Times article. Kennedy, in his own CIA request, November 12th, and also in his paper to NASA about going to the moon with the Russians, he says we need to share the high threat cases with the Soviets. He's saying the same thing because what's happening is he's creating a rationale for why we should share this. He figures, in order for us to lower the nuclear tensions, to go to the moon together, all this stuff, it can be a cooperative world moving forward. No reason for a Cold War, no reason for the Vietnam War, no reason for us to nuke Cuba. And these people are losing their minds when he's doing this stuff. But there's a thread there. If you can track X-Share, you're going to go through people like Hillenkotter. You're going to go through people like McDonald. And LBJ is the opportunist in the middle of all that. But in 1960, as the Senate Majority Leader, he's fixed. You can go, and it's on the record, he's fixed to lead a UFO disclosure conference committee in the Senate. He's calling for it there. That's LBJ. LBJ, they called him Senator NASA because he was so deep in the space program. That's who we're talking about. And unfortunately, though, he's from, he's tied in with the corrupt side. And so his job basically is just to swoop in there when Kennedy was gone. And there's no question that he is complicit and probably, in my opinion, even active involved with the JFK assassination. But it's the Central Intelligence Agency, X Protect, that assassinates the president. And somebody like Johnson needs to know, he's on a need-to-know basis. You're going to step into the presidency, which, by the way, is a lot nicer than a prison cell, which is where he was headed. And Kennedy was also throwing him off the ticket for 64. So those things, I think, become important pieces of the puzzle. And they go right to the X technology in the UFO file. Yes.
David Tormina, DJ, Antarctica, the location of Earth's magnetic positive pole. What if they simply placed a magnetized disc into the pole and it took off like a bat out of hell from pole to pole?
Well, that reminds me of the story. Look, there's no explanation. There's a lot of things in history that don't have any explanation. The International Geophysical Year is one, which involves Antarctica. But Operation High Jump, there's no explanation for why they left, except the strange conversation that Admiral Byrd has with a Chilean journalist on the way back, saying the next war is going to be with these discs that can fly pole to pole. Now, there's some people who've discussed the language of what he said, but he's talking about being attacked by something. And, you know, whether or not he was saying flying saucers were attacking me, there's some reason he got out of there. They were afraid. And that was going to be a long expedition. And he'd been there many, many times. Well, it's interesting because I went back and looked at reports. And if you look at some of the declassified reports from the 60s, you will see that anytime you get around Antarctica, you have major, major UFO activity. And some of the people who aren't deep in the government would make reports about it because they were just outside of US government control around Antarctica. And they'd be working for some South American agency or something. They'd be like, we just had 36 UFO sightings in 2 days or something. So it's a major magnet for this kind of activity. And there's no question that during high jump, they were spooked out of there. Something was down there. Now, for a long time, people have supposed there's some kind of, offshoot breakaway of the Nazis that went to Antarctica. I think that there's a major piece. There's like Antarctica fulfills a mythology, and it, all the way from the Piraeus map where it's shown with no ice on it, it's a whole continent. And it's just as big as the United States and Mexico combined, right? So it's a gigantic landmass. We don't understand the nature of the things that are going on there. And I think the very unusual, sort of 2017, 2018 activity down there with Buzz Aldrin and Kerry and all the rest of it tell us a lot about this change that's happening. But remember, last week we talked about the Casey readings. And what did Casey talk about? Earth changes, massive earth changes, where things shift, like poles, for example. So where things are frigid, they become tropical or whatever. So they may be seeing that aspect going on there. But I think we're looking at something in the nature. We get hints. John Warner was on the program more like about 6 weeks ago. And on a couple of different occasions, he's told us about his dad, Senator Warner, and his involvement with deep freeze. And deep freeze started in 63 when Kennedy was still in office. So maybe they thought, well, Kennedy won't go along. He wants to share the UFO file, and we have this whole Antarctica thing, and, he's got deep freeze, and like, this is not going to go well. Deep freeze, nobody really knows a great deal about. But one of the things that Warner let out to his son, John Warner, who's, regular guest on this program, is that he said, basically, he was asking him, what is it about, Dad? And John Warner said, it's about space. So whatever it is that's going on there, whether they've found a way to help them, interrelate with space or launch things into space, whatever it happens to be, that's what deep freeze has been about. And interestingly enough, it can be a conglomeration of different scientists from different countries. And this is part of what Kennedy was looking forward to. But now, can you imagine with the level that we're at with Russia, this is exactly what Kennedy tried to avoid. And so it's fascinating that his nephew, RFK Jr., is coming forward in the Democratic race and saying, look, Ukraine war is the most obscene thing, 500,000 people dead. Some estimates are 750,000 people are dead in 1 year. So, blowing up the pipeline was one of the worst environmental disasters in history. Much
I think
worse.
It is the worst.
Yeah, absolutely. And much worse than some factory that's going to pump CO2. Like, come on, none of this stuff makes sense the way that they're doing it. Like, oh, you need carbon credits and all this stuff, and you're blowing up pipelines and destroying the atmosphere. And engaging in nuclear power. Like, so, the language is schizophrenic. And how long can you, go along in the country with schizophrenic leadership like that? I mean, certainly not for another term. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. Whew, JFK assassination breakthrough. Miss Olivia is throwing the questions, and I'm doing my best. Byrd Antarctica Nazis UFO file. I want to remind you, especially if you're new to the program, go to darkjournalist.com and sign up for the newsletter. That's what keeps us in touch and gets around the remarkable censorship that the stories just, keep coming out. There are more and more hardcore about the way that things are censored, and our own work is massively censored. And yet somehow it's getting through the help of the Ideas Room. That's you. And here we are. So we're going to keep doing it, and through any platform and any program. And, I love all the social media. I'll do it as long as we're on any platform. But the best and the most sure way is to go directly to darkjournalist.com, sign up for the newsletter, and you'll get all the information about wonderful interviews, shows, X-series episodes, documentaries, events, the whole thing. And that's the best way to stay in touch with us. And of course, subscribe to the show, get behind the work that we're doing here. And to all our subscribers, hello, and I salute you. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Sick of the BS says, could the extensive cover-up about the UFOs be a demand of the extraterrestrials?
Well, this is important, and it's interesting because a lot of the struggle about they've tried to make the UFO thing into a game, like, oh, like, we have these ships, these beach balls attacking our ships, and things of this nature. So, and they've tried to be like, oh, this CIA person has the answers, and he'll come on your show and he'll say, I can't divulge that, right? So they've made it this whole weird thing, or they'll talk about, oh, it has such substantial G-force. None of that stuff, those are all lesser details when you get right down to it. The question that you just asked gets much more into the territory that I think that we can learn from. That's the area that I'm going into, which is there's no possible way for humanity not to open up to the experience of something else that's here. No government on earth can stop you from doing that. What they can do is confuse the issue, and that's what they're very busy at. On a government level, the question then that you're asking is, have aliens made deals with them, and then have those deals come forward, part of those deals being like, you can't talk about our presence here? There's a very interesting...
Until we say so.
Until we say so, yeah. There is an interesting series of kind of UFO lore about these treaties and things that have been signed. And they go something like this, and I think they have some merit. They go something like, our government got involved with a group that was extraterrestrial, and they were spiritually minded, and they offered, kind of during the height of the Cold War, when the nuclear threat was at its peak until recently, thanks to Stepford Biden, they came in and said, you're going to destroy yourselves. We can give you, these concepts to live together in peace. And, you can talk about our presence here. And that the Eisenhower administration said, no, but we'll take assistance in technology, And they said, no, you'll use it for military purposes. And so those kind of angelic Pleiadian style aliens stopped dealing with us because they were rebuffed. Then the Greys, who were a scientific group, who were opportunistic and wanted to do experiments on human beings, they said, look, we will share some technology with you, but you have to give us free, unfettered access for what we're doing. Don't shoot at our stuff. Don't interfere. And our government said, well, we'll take that deal, but you have to give us a list of everyone that you've abducted. And that this whole program of tracking the people who were abducted came up. Now, it's interesting because supposedly after a little while, the Greys stopped the deal, as it were, and they just were like, okay, we're doing our abductions, like, you can't stop us. And there's also a strange thing that plays into this for anyone who follows these UFO stories, and I think it's absolutely crucial, which is the UFO abduction phenomena seems to have stopped. And one of the things we've pointed out on this show is it seems like it was sometime before the vax really kicked in. It's almost like they knew this thing was coming that was, the whole pharmaceutical thing was going to change the chemistry of the human being. And they wanted to kind of, work with the more perfect version. So those stories are there, and they're hard to deny that there's something about contact with these other off-world civilizations. Now, you also have an entirely interdimensional aspect, but I don't like interdimensional the way that it's used. You had Andre Carson, this ridiculous Democratic congressman, going, wow, those UFOs might be interdimensional. Stay tuned. When they're talking like that, it's a bad scene. It means they have phony, AI generated versions of beings that they're going to project. It has nothing to do with reality. But in speaking about the real thing, we know that there are all kinds of levels of awareness and realms. That gets us into, the whole kind of alchemy of the situation that we're talking about. That's totally different, and that's more important. And we can get that from each other. People have experiences with those types of things in families. I have the most remarkable stories that I've heard from people about these experiences. None of them had anything to do with the government. Yes. Forget about the government disclosures. Total lie. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Chris Lothian, if Lockheed Martin had the technology to, quote, take ET home, wouldn't that
Yes.
mean they got time travel technology so that in turn could mean that the aliens, in quotes, might be time traveling humans?
Yeah. What's weird is that Spielberg has been out there pushing this time traveling humans thing. And then Mike Gallagher, congressman from Wisconsin, is like, they might be time travelers from our future to give us a message. It's so weird. It is so weird that this stuff is the way it is. It's, we're going into a very unusual area and era of time. Now, what I would say is this, is that what we study here on the show and talk about in the ideas room it's like a logical cutting through the lies to get to the real thing. But we're doing it together and in such a way that I think that we can get to these types of truths without any, kind of other interference. So my basic thought is that what you need is an open mind to really extraordinary things, which we should have never been shut out from in the first place. But the society locked people into a number of things. It locked them into thinking that psychic development was a joke, that astrology was, a horoscope in a newspaper. These are ancient arts, the whole thing. The mystery schools have left that information there. And so that's part of your birthright is, the kind of spiritual dimension of the thing. And so that's where you get a much deeper level than, some UFO disclosure hearing in Congress where they're looking for money for, Gillibrand and Rubio to ram through the National Defense Authorization Act. And it's already a bloated bill at $1 trillion. And you want to create a UFO defense office. So we've got the real thing going on, and it's a human experience. Look, a lot of people think of this. A lot of people have lived and died now contemplating the alien thing. Some of them have had alien experiences, right? What about the Pascagoula guys, for example? One of them is still with us, and one's left, but a number of people have already experienced these things. They've lived and died with that reality, and they've passed it on to us as a kind of consciousness. And so there's no government that can give you, here's the file on that. It doesn't exist. It goes person to person. It's our own interpersonal experience. And it is powerful, and there is a huge mystery to it. But, Andre Carson, the congressman, he's what is he going to give you? This is part of the game. The only thing that the government people know how to do is play games and exploit. That's the way that it's been. And there's been a very small group at the government level who's done anything but. Yes.
All right, I got to ask this. MR Neutron, why not talk about the human off-world slave trade? It's like alternative 3.
Yeah, I always feel like there's a kind of trying to make my tie clip not reflect in everyone's eyes today. I'm thinking that a lot of that stuff was put out there, as a kind of meme for people to pick up on. And it was part of the exaggeration of the weird ideas that the CIA likes to put out there about an alien threat. What's interesting is the secret space program and the labor involved, just like the underground bases, involves a division of labor where those people, since they don't exist, technically don't have any of the rights that we would assume. And so if you think about Gary McKinnon cracking into the off-world officers list and all the things that we've listed around the secret space program, which is, the whole thing we're doing with the blue secret space program, it's interesting. I want to point this out also, which is back in April, we talked about this blue secret space piece. And then in the Maui fires, all of a sudden, all these things are coming up blue. And this is the weird alchemy of the exchange of ideas in this show as well, because things open up before we see them. And it's not that I'm any kind of, prophet or predictor of anything like that. It's just that there's something about when we penetrate into these ideas together, so things open up. And so we start to pick up on the zeitgeist in the vibrational space before it actually hits the ground. And so some of the information that I was getting about, the whole thing that they created around the secret space program, it's blue. That's where Blue Book comes from. That's Blue Beam. Everything all relates directly to the blue. And then everywhere they were showing this thing about how if the blue houses and blue this and blue that survived through all the Maui fires. This is an interesting thing. This is the exchange of the inspiration with the reality together. And it happens with you, it happens with me. This is very interesting territory. And it is the X concepts, that when we get rolling with this, these things open up. Look, 5 years ago, I came out doing these shows and said, we have X-steganography at the heart of it. It was based on research. I had sort of figured something out. Then little by little, those X things started showing up all over the place in culture. And they were out, so this gets interesting to me. Yeah.
It's simple. Seeking you shall find.
Yeah, it is. Oh, no, it is.
That's it. You ask a question, and if you just pursue it, things open up for you. That's God's promise. I do.
Yeah, but I want to say this though, which is, you also, there's an assimilation process. So a lot of people, and I want to point this out in terms of getting information. A lot of people think I need to keep taking information in. What it actually is you need to assimilate the information properly. Whether you're me, someone in the ideas room, anybody out there listening to this. Assimilation, just like in a digestive process, is crucial. If you just take in more and more food, what happens? You don't get any nutrition. There are people who keep eating and eating and eating, and they starve to death, right?
Actually, what you're talking about, these are puzzle pieces, and you can reach out and grab one, but you actually have to put it in its place. That's sort of what the assimilating. What does this connect to? Where does this lock in with my knowledge that I have already gained, so that the picture is forming properly? Because too many people just sort of keep taking it in, and it's not creating a cohesive picture for them.
No, it also creates, I think, maybe a short circuiting of the nervous system, because at a certain point, somebody's on Twitter and it's like outrage after outrage after outrage, and sometimes you'll open that thing up and people are just, having their, really getting beat up or whatever. And it's just, over and over and over again. So it's a level in how you assimilate it. By the way, you can be kept away from your own higher understanding and awakening by too much low level media. So where are you going to get more inspirational things? Whether it's here or in books that you love, concepts that are there. These things, they are rich and they're multiple. Look at the Gurdjieff work. You could spend your life reading the Gurdjieff material and still never figure it out. It's fascinating. The Casey work, it's so extensive that, there's something like 15,000 readings that we know of. But it's a whole life's work of the nature of this channel. So there's so many important things, I would say. And I think when it comes to any of this work, that's crucial. But I will say this, flashing back to starting this show. When you look now and you see X out of the closet, it is a different perspective. Like, we do understand then that we've kind of seen things coming in. And so therefore, our own pace becomes more rapid in a sense. Our own ability to sense things becomes better. So, it's important for us to look at that history. And, I'm happy to, talk about ideas, theorize, etc. But when we've put things forward and you see them out there in the world, the things picking up speed, it becomes part of a general realization of all of us, I guess, is the best way to put it. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. This is JFK Assassination Breakthrough. X, Byrd, multiple Byrds in this case, Antarctica, Nazis in the UFO file. We're going to take a few more of your questions. And before we do that, I'm just going to say, for the record, this is the court case. August 17th, 2023, AARC versus CIA opposition to motion for summary affirmance has filed. The name of the case is USCA case number 23 5-50. I'll start that again. USCA case number 23-5064, filed 8/17/2023, United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia, from Assassination Archives and Research Center, and the appellee defendant, as it were, the Central Intelligence Agency. A couple of other things. United States Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit, Assassination Archives and Research, Inc. versus the Central Intelligence Agency. Appellants AARC and Lasar's response opposing CIA's motion for summary affirmance. And the person who is at AARC is James Lazar. He's the one who brought the case involving DRAM against the CIA. And that is the name of the case for everyone involved. And they're calling it a Freedom of Information Act case. And he's talking about there's a long background here, but here's the kind of a key point that opens up to what we were speaking about tonight. And they make clear we don't espouse any particular theory about the assassination of President Kennedy, so keep that in mind. The FOIA request seeks record related to the owner of the Texas School Book Depository building in 1963, David Harold Byrd. Byrd's African safari hunting host and guest visitor to Dallas in the late 1963, Werner von Elvensleben, DRAM, who, according to released CIA predecessor organization, Office of Strategic Services, OSS records, had served as an assassin for the Nazi leader Heinrich Himmler in Germany in 1933. OSS document 9 from 9/28/1945, and he cites the paragraph, etc. The 1954 Doolittle report recommended that the CIA be permitted to act ruthlessly and beyond the norms of civilized human conduct to achieve its goals in the Cold War. Remember, this is what the CIA is bred from. This is where the alien threat thing and the assassinations, that's because the CIA is cut from this. By the way, I want to point out that there are all kinds of support people who the CIA attracted, with various jobs and things like that. It's not that there are no good people who work for the CIA. It's that good people eventually who are there get burned out because the CIA, the core of the organization, is extra constitutional and functions as an evil organization at its leadership level. So that's kind of the better way to think about it. President Kennedy was said to have been hit by bullets fired from the Texas Schoolbook Depository building at the time of the assassination. David Harold Byrd owned the building. David Harold Byrd was a cousin of U.S. Senator Harry Byrd, Sr. of Virginia. Senator Byrd led the massive resistance strategy to Brown versus Board of Education school integration. David Harold Byrd financially supported Admiral Byrd's explorations in Antarctica. That's pure X series in a court case. In appreciation, Admiral Byrd named a mountain range in Antarctica the Harold Byrd Mountains. There you go. So they go on basically, and so this is what they're requesting: a search for and release of all records of information in any format related to David Harold Byrd, deceased, of Dallas, Texas. Mr. Byrd died on September 14th, 1986. See attached obituary. Mr. Byrd owned the Texas Schoolbook Depository building at the time of the assassination of President Kennedy in 1963 and reportedly removed the sniper's window from the building after the assassination and displayed it in his mansion. Mr. Byrd was an owner and financier of government contracting companies, including Texas Engineering Manufacturing, Temco, E-Systems, and Ling Temco Vout LTV, as we were talking about Professor Scott and the profit taking that was going on there with that company that before the assassination from $3 million, and then by 1965 paid off $55 million for Byrd. David Harold Byrd was also active in the oil business and varied other business enterprises. He co-founded the Civil Air Patrol in 1941 and served in command capacities in CAP until the 1960s. Now, one of the things I want to point out here is that he also worked for Cord Meyer Sr. Now, this is very important because Cord Meyer Jr. is implicated in the Kennedy assassination. E. Howard Hunt implicated him, and his wife was very close to, Mary Meyer was very close to Kennedy, and Kennedy shared a lot of secrets when he was assassinated. Then she was assassinated shortly after. So, these things, when we think about them, these things all work together. But there's much more to this case, and we're going to track it closely, but you can already see they are looking for the records about Dry Hole Byrd, and the Antarctica piece is going to come in through Byrd and his family. And then we're getting the whole bit about Dram, the Nazi assassin, who Dry Hole Byrd just happened as we open the show with. So you can see that this is going to be significant and is a bombshell going into the 60th anniversary. Quite remarkable. Miss Olivia, we'll take some more questions.
Sick of the BS. DJ, if Trump declined JFK disclosure once, would he twice?
Well, no, I think because he's so on the record about it at this point that he would let it out. I think they convinced him the first time, or he may have held the card of that knowledge against them and figured this is something, I can use to leverage against the CIA. It's quite possible. The UFO file and the JFK assassination files, Trump had access. But you have to understand this about Trump. Before going into the presidency, he's got all of the John Trump information. And, this isn't something that we have to guess at. If John Trump was the protege of Vannevar Bush, who led the UFO file for 20 years and sent John Trump in to get Tesla's papers, he trusted him at that super high X technology level. And then Trump muses in all these conversations about his super smart uncle who shared all these things with him. Those are pretty easy dots to connect. Then connect that up with the incredible efforts at removing Trump beyond any normal politics. So, all of the regular politics that go back and forth, whatever. But for me, that's very significant. And then the final piece there on the surface for understanding what we know about Trump is Roy Cohn. And if you think about this takes Trump out of the, he's a loudmouth, independent real estate guy who was like this incredible financial guy in the 80s and 90s and, a TV host and all this stuff. And then he got in the presidency. That's not why they don't like Trump. They don't like Trump because he is on the same parity with them in terms of knowledge about the UFO file. That's where you get Space Force. Then they're stuck dealing with the Kennedy dynamic again. I want the UFO file back under presidential control. That's a huge fight. And this really gets to the heart of the geopolitical situation we're looking at now, where you're going to indict a former president for the first time in history 4 times. And one of the things that I don't like that's floating around, and people like Tucker Carlson keep mentioning this stuff. It's not healthy to mention, but that whole thing about Trump being assassinated, it's the only thing left that they can do. They have mechanisms for moving the country into a continuity of government emergency powers place. And so all the things that they're doing, remember, they have a very small support group. Their support politically for Joe Biden or Justin Trudeau or any of these people is not significant enough to govern. Certainly not. And the only way that they can do this is through emergency powers. And so whatever it takes, the UFO threat, cyber grid attack, false flag, nuclear incident, they'll utilize that. But the UFO threat is the one that's being warmed up. There's no question about it. And unfortunately, instead of seeing that being warmed up by all this CIA activity about the CIA giving people disclosure, the people who've studied it and who became kind of, respected in the UFO field, they're the ones who are being like the circus jokers. And that's where you get the Rogan stuff. Yes.
I love this question. By the way, I just want to say Trump must have one hell of a dead man switch. So I don't think he's going to do it. David Tormina says, DJ, do you think Trump might make a deal to stand down if Biden does as well? No way in hell would Trump ever stand down.
No. No, he had an opportunity to, bail out of these elections and not face these indictments. There's no question about it. Their response to him staying in was the Mar-a-Lago raid. But the Mar-a-Lago raid is weird too. And there's a document chase that starts there, which has to do with the National Archives. And actually the person, David Ferrier, who was in charge of the National Archives thing and worked with legal authorities on this first charge against Trump. It's interesting to me because it was Douglas Caddy. We sent to him, the National Archivist, a request for him to find the Nixon time capsule message. It's the same guy. So I found that, it's just very strange, his position. And then he resigns after they do this thing with Trump and somebody else takes over, and they're both big anti-Trump people. But there's something that's been missing for me in the research around the records, because the Mar-a-Lago records, the Mar-a-Lago raid, the way that they searched things, the way that they created, like going through Melania's clothes and things like that. Then Pence records, they went through Pence. Then they said, oh, Biden kept things, in his office, and then he kept things in his garage and all this stuff. We know that Obama left with 5 million records. Clinton had all kinds of classified material, and it got dismissed in a case because the court was like, well, basically if he was the president, they're his records, so there's no problem. So this case has no legal foundation. So what was it actually? What is the document aspect? What was the paper chase? It has to involve one of two things: the UFO file or the JFK assassination files, because those things cut to the heart of the deep state power thing. Now, are we looking at large scale technological takeover, biometric takeover, digital IDs, electronic concentration camps? This is the nature of the era that we're in. And you could say, well, are the JFK records or the UFO file, is that going to be the hot thing when you have all this stuff closing in? Well, if those people have depended on a system over 8 decades that has kept them in power, and if you reveal the core of the power of that system before they throw the switch for total control, then they have a huge problem. So therefore, they'd by any means keep somebody like Trump or RFK Jr. out of the White House. So, something got missed in the paper chase around the records. Keep that in mind. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Whew. Excellent to be here with you tonight. The JFK assassination breakthrough, Dram, X, Byrd, Antarctica, Nazis, and the UFO file. Take a couple more of your questions, and then we'll leave you to the next episode where I guarantee we're going to cover even more of this. But here's a quick little piece around this. And by the way, this I guess this Dram guy, I found this stock photo of him modeling. That's a modeling shot before this is a stock photo, so it still has the watermark on it. But there he is. He's the model assassin in 1932, wow. Just pre-Nazi Germany. Werner von Elvensleben had one son also named Werner, who was responsible for the attempted assassination of Austrian, Farrell can help with this word, Heimwehrführer, Dr. Richard Steidl. That was the assassination. Very interesting indeed. But his dad was also named Werner von Elvensleben. He was the character who, as I mentioned, was a political advisor and a force in the early uprising of the Nazis in 1933, them taking over, and then was thrown out in 1934 and even appeared in one of Hitler's speeches as a traitor. But then all of a sudden, boom, 4 months later, he's let out of prison. Everything's hunky-dory. So there's something strange about that aspect of it. And I think it relates to the fact that this is an aristocratic family, and these are deep, this is the deep state coming at us from old Europe, as it were. Yes.
Najat Madri, to have a massive surveillance state, it requires massive energy. Could all of this also be about energy?
Yeah, I'm going to answer that in the context of this show, but your question actually goes to something very significant in the grand scheme of things. But I think that something was discovered about the International Geophysical Year, and I'm going to bring out that episode shortly. I've been working on it. But one of the really crucial things in there is that suddenly the International Geophysical Year hits and the satellite piece is there. And by the way, Berkner is the one who reads to the world that the Russians have launched Sputnik, how we need to catch up and all this kind of thing. So that's weird too. So if you really do the dots on Berkner through his life, he shows up 22-year-old whiz kid with our friend Admiral Byrd in Antarctica, setting up for 2 years radio. That's pretty significant. Next, we get our friend moving through World War II. And then we get him showing up, heading up the Robertson panel on UFOs. That's the first major research program on UFOs. I mean, there were things like Grudge and stuff in-house before, but the Robertson panel was supposed to be the piece, 1952. Then we get him heading up the IGY, International Geophysical Year. He's the one who creates it. This is why we should do this. And that takes us to 57 and 58. And then he shows up waiting, for the flag he's going to get from the president, the trademark. By the way, he never gets it. And they were going to make some announcement that was going to shatter things internationally, according to Berkner's own notes. So we never get to hear that. And then he shows up with McDonald, the UFO researcher, and LBJ's aide, and then dies after having a hamburger. So, those are pretty strange dots. And again, you have JFK, the UFO file, and Antarctica. I mean, just look at him. How many people do we have like that? Well, Byrd has Antarctica through his cousin, who he funded to do the expeditions, D.H. Byrd, funding Richard Byrd. And then we have the UFO file through his experimental aerospace piece. And then you have the assassination taking place in his building. He also has the code. He's got the UFO code, Antarctica, and the JFK assassination. What's going on there? So, this gets us very interesting territory. And what's interesting is the amount of UFO activity around the JFK assassination really tells you what was going on there. That relates directly to the X technology. So that's my way of answering that something was found in the International Geophysical Year which changed the way things were done. And I think we may have even done a sort of a snow job, no pun intended, on the Russians in that period by including them, saying like, we're going to Antarctica with you. And something was going on there. And I think it involved UFO file espionage. So yeah, but that's one to watch, IGY. And of course, there's a Donald Fagen song called IGY. I never knew it was about the same thing. Mm-hmm. Yes, Miss Olivia, go for it.
Okay, let's talk about nukes for a second. David Tremaine says they nuked the atmosphere during the geophysical year. Weird coincidence there. Chris Lothian said Fletcher Prouty said that he'd been sent down to Antarctica to inspect some kind of nuclear facility where they're working on mini nukes. And Nina says again, scratching my head about this new tiny nuke engine thing. How the heck do we think the Pioneers and Voyagers are still going 50 years later? So what's the nuclear connection to all this? Have they had mini nukes down in Antarctica for 50 plus years?
Well, this is interesting. There's a program called Starfish where they did explode nukes in outer space. Now, this is incredibly dangerous, obviously. And there are questions about the nuclear reaction if it does other things. And then, so we get into a lot of interesting territory when we're talking about traditional nuclear. We all know that, Chernobyl, 3 Mile Island, there's a whole history of these huge disasters involving the plants that are involved. And then, the area is radiated for years. And so what's interesting is if you go back to 1987 in the meeting in Reykjavik that Reagan has with Gorbachev, what's interesting is they both cite that meeting, of which no agreement came out, as the most significant meeting of the whole thing, even though later they got together and actually organized to reduce nukes. When they came out of that 1987 meeting, they had negotiated a zero option of no nuclear weapons, period. Now you can imagine the shockwaves that this sent out, and just the idea of having no nuclear weapons. What's that all about? Were they about to say, we have this other thing, and together collectively now we can both announce it to the world? And they got kicked around something terrible, and SDI got really amped up, and all these weird things happened. And of course, there was a lot in SDI about scaring Reagan, too, don't forget, as we learned from Norm Berggren, showing him these incredibly large ships fueling in the rings of Saturn. Was that all CGI, or were they showing him the real thing? It's a lot of people involved. And so they were able to scare him into this mentality. But I think whatever it was that he was seeing, he was saying, this is the time for us to get together. And he took it up to another level. Now, in a previous episode, I read how Colin Powell, in his own bio, said that he had taken out all the references to aliens and the UFO file out of Reagan's speeches. So he'd get it. Reagan would mention something about the UFO file. Colin Powell, Bush's henchman, is basically sitting there taking it out. So there's something significant there when we get that aspect going on with Gorbachev and then them two talking about a zero option on nuclear. It tells us something about the world that we're living in, which means there was a totally replaceable substitute for nuclear weapons in 1987. Well, how many years ago was that? 35, 36 years ago? So where are things really now? This is why it gets me when they're talking about AI on the level that they are now, because they roll out the technology like this, especially something advanced like that. They've had it in-house for 50 years, maybe. They know so much about it. So, the hand wringing about, should we let this out? And, should we be doing AI and all? They know the implications of AI, and they've staged the conversations back and forth about what we should be using. And I think there's a real conversation to be had about it. Don't get me wrong, but let's get real. The only way to assess the current situation is to really understand that in terms of technological know-how, these people are very far advanced beyond us because they've hidden these things from the public. And in some ways, the public is complicit because they haven't demanded from that government that it be transparent when it came to these things. But I think what we're discovering goes around now disclosure and transparency. We're coming to an idea that we can work individually, around these things. And I'm going to bring it down to something like psychic experience, UFO, the UFO file research that goes outside, nothing to do with the government. Forget about the government. All of these things fall into the human realm, and the levels of research go into it. That's really, the technology can serve a situation like that, and that's massively decentralizing. So I don't think the government would like that at all. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show, X Series 155. We're taking your questions. We're going to take a couple more, and then we're going to leave you. Miss Olivia's here. Before we go any further, if you're new here, sign up for the newsletter. It's free, and you're going to get all the episodes before anybody there, right in your newsletter. And you're going to hear about all the exciting things that we have coming up for you. You can also subscribe to the program, get behind the work that we're doing here. And the best way to do all that is to be a subscriber and also to get the free newsletter. That's the way to get around the censorship, because these are the types of conversations, your questions, the things that we're talking about, the things that go on in the ideas room here on the Dark Journalist Show. Those are the types of things that they don't want people thinking about at all. And, I extend that out to the people that are guests on our program and support the work that we do. And nobody, makes it alone when it comes to this. It's all, it's a John Lennon quote, I think, and everybody influences everybody. And you just have to be very aware of the influence, that you're getting, and make sure it's the right one for you. And so we have that going on. And we have great examples of it. I think
cross-pollination. Exactly.
I wanted to point out that one of the episodes that we have coming up is on Paris Flamand. Oh, I have to show you this as well. This is a General Dynamics deck of cards, 1963, same year of the assassination. The Joker is Superman. This is going to be significant and come in handy for those of you who are going to tune in to our X Series episode this September, because the IGY piece and all the rest.
He's wearing blue.
Watch out for General Dynamics. Hey, he's wearing blue. You got it. Miss Olivia, you're up.
MG says this could possibly be your best show yet, DJ.
Thank you. Well, it's great questions. When I see things that we've talked about breaking on the national stage, it's always an important thing for us to tune in and to say, what is it that we have? What is it that we've learned from these things? What are we kind of coming around to? And I think one of the crucial things is that the aspect that we've been talking about that's been operating in the dark around the advanced technology, around, this kind of super astral, piece, and this astral agency piece when it comes to intelligence stuff. We'll check in with Gigi Young on that. And the things that Dr. Farrell talked about in his books, let's say 2014, 2015, relating to this Nazi aspect hanging out in the background. If you track back through Jim Marrs and the Fourth Reich, Mae Brussel and her work, pointing out this influence of these paperclip Nazis coming in and influencing. Now, some people might say, oh, yeah, America's been all Nazi, It's not what I'm saying at all. Look, the Russians got their group of Nazi scientists and took them in and tried to learn from them as well. We weren't doing anything that wasn't expected. The problem is there's a kind of martial philosophy that comes with the scientific achievement. This is the thing that needs to be identified. And you can do that. And, you can very much respect the ideals that America is founded upon and the great country that we can be. No question about it. We have that incredible ability. So it's not a tear down of America, but if you don't deal with real history and what the deep state has done, you're never going to get to the right answers. You're going to be, they're going to have the next COVID op, the alien threat op, the UFO threat op, and, and the shows, the media shows, the other entertainment and whatever, you're going to get fluffy, horrible, like Knapp, Corbell, and Grush. I mean, it's junk. It's real junk. You're not learning anything. And you have phony whistleblowers, phony journalists, and, phony companies pretending, oh, we're transparent. I'm Spotify with $300 million. You're not telling anybody anything. But you have the ability to. You've got a microphone. You've got 2 turntables and a microphone. Mm-hmm. You can do it. Yeah, you have the ability to do it, but you're not doing it. It's not happening. So that's a problem. So you see how that works? It's not a takedown when we get into these things. It's a revelation about the whole paperclip thing. And that's how we get to the good route on the UFO file. I'm sorry, Miss Olivia, what was your question?
No, I was just thinking it's empty calories versus like real nourishment.
That's a really, talk about putting it where it is. I wanted to put this out there. There's a book called Appointment on the Moon. And this is also going to, for those of you looking for things that are important to crisscross some of the research that we're doing here. Richard Lewis, Appointment on the Moon. This book is cited in the Torbit document, which is right after the Apollo missions, giving us the kind of backstory of the Nazi attempt to take over space and how that translated into NASA and that whole breakaway piece. Very important book, along with, if we're really to understand that program, the Clarence Lasby classic Project Paperclip, this book from the 1970s, which outlines the whole thing. And Clarence Lasby, associate professor of history at the University of Texas at Austin, interviewed and corresponded with 200 participants in Project Paperclip. That's crucial. So getting to the real kind of root of the thing, I think is key. Okay, we'll take 2 more questions, Miss Olivia, and we're out.
Patrick Vidine, perhaps the Sons of Belial are based in Antarctica.
Yeah. Well, see, now that's kind of that's where my mind goes as well, which is I think that there's a remnant. And I think it's the remnant is crucial for consideration. That's the story that we get through Casey when he's talking about Ezekiel. As I pointed out in that episode last week, this is a crucial piece of information he gives out, which is when they're asking him, you're talking about these advanced aircraft going around. What are you talking about? What were they like? And he says, well, there's a description of them. They're just like what Ezekiel saw, but that was a much later date. So now we know that Casey's story of Atlantis, they're all the way, there's 200,000 years of development, but they have a height around 50,700 BC, and then another height, 28,000 BC, and then they're really at a great height at 10,500 BC, but they turn the technology on themselves and destroy themselves so that, aspects of their culture needs to shoot off to different places around the globe. This is important information that Casey is giving us with the Ezekiel part, because he's saying somebody kept the technology from 10,500 BC all the way through to 1500 BC. So therefore, the story of Ezekiel, part of it's an Atlantean story, but who had the technology? There's some mystery school that kept it. And that's where the whole remnant idea exists. Now, you have to imagine, just as the good groups survived and saw things in advance, many of the other groups around Belial got destroyed, no question about it, through this kind of, right makes might attitude. But some of them got away too, I'm sure. And why not Antarctica, as it were? After all, we know at a certain point it was completely free of ice. Well, it's interesting because people who look at North America say it was covered by ice. So it didn't become really the habitable place in the kind of beautiful terrain that it is now until maybe 10,000 years ago. Yes, Miss Olivia.
Cheryl Crawford, question: is DJ aware that today it was announced that the Pentagon will set up a website so the UFO file can be viewed?
Wow. I printed that out and I was going to talk about it. I did not get around to it, but it is very interesting. Arrow, is the government. They're the government piece they're the UFO Defense Office, the technical one. And they are, basically it's Christian Gillibrand and Rubio and that whole group. And they've got Kirkpatrick in there and all the rest of it. But that's where they want to funnel and create that military funnel for a UFO Defense Office. They added it at the risk of blocking $1 trillion in funds. They added it to the NDAA for 2024. That's how we got stuck with it, through their efforts, because they were on the Senate Intelligence Committees. They had the ability to do it, a Democrat and a Republican. Why were they working together? Because UFO dough is UFO money. And they both want it. And that's why you see people, swinging flags and standing on chairs and saying, we have to get the truth from that government. Wait, I am the government. Because somebody inside there is saying, hey, come here, UAP, dollar signs. You see that? And so there's weird stuff going on there. And whenever I see these people, I always want to ask them, how did you get involved with UFOs? Why are you interested in UFOs? Ruben Gallego, who's supposedly a leading Democratic contender for Senate now in Arizona, after saying you'll get the truth about that UAP out there, he's an interesting one, and I keep an eye on him because he was up here at Harvard. And what did he study at Harvard? Well, look at his own bio: crowd control, psychological methods. Then you get a guy like that in the UFO file. So, it's dangerous stuff. It needs to be pointed out in a regular kind of journalistic research fashion. And it seems like when you do that, all the people who are becoming, spoon-fed junk conspiracy or, these narratives around the UFO file now, those people think that, you're attacking my hero or whatever. No, I mean, if anybody is legit, like Grush or whatever, then you can really drill down into their past and their history, just like you would anyone who was, on the political stage or was making some dramatic claim. Um, you are subject to journalistic interpretation. That means research on your past, um, you know, psychologically where you stand, what kind of ideology do you have? These are standard things, but somehow all that goes out the window when you get around this stuff. I find that interesting. To me, that is the CIA not wanting their ops to blow up, and so they create, this whole thing. That's very much like the whole woke. It has a correlation with the woke cancel culture piece, which you can't ask questions about it. You've offended me. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. Last question: JFK assassination breakthrough. X, Byrd, Antarctica, Nazis, and the UFO file. Miss Olivia, you're up.
Well, I do want to ask. I have to ask a question for a regular. So Talmutek Ophirgol says, please, what is the Steiner title? He was asked not to publish. I think it was Blavatsky who asked him. DJ knows.
Well, there's a few things there. Originally, they didn't want him to mention the eighth sphere. And then it came out through esoteric Buddhism and AP Senate, and it came out in a haphazard fashion, which created the moon as the eighth sphere. And so Blavatsky tried to correct the record or put the genie back in the bottle, and it didn't work. And so Steiner had to address that whole issue himself. But then he said, the mystery schools keep the eighth sphere. That was like one of their top secrets, to keep out of kind of mechanical conversation, So whenever you get around esoteric information, you have the esoteric and the exoteric. This is the Gurdjieff circle of ideas. When it's in its pure form, its exoteric form, it is conscious information. When it gets added to the exoteric, so the first one is the esoteric, the second one is the exoteric. The exoteric acts mechanically because it's just the world of things. It acts in repetition, sleep, mechanicalness. And so in the mystery schools, they learned how to keep and grow, the knowledge in the in the esoteric circle, and then let the ideas out, even though they act mechanically, into the esoteric, exoteric circle. So everyday life, and then the life underneath, behind that. So I think that might be what you're referring to. The only other thing I can think of is that Steiner had prepared a number of Armon lectures for his special students, and those weren't public. But when World War II hit, he thought that the mystery schools and anthroposophy had failed because they hadn't reached enough of a critical mass to stop that disaster. And he said, I'm not going to hold stuff back anymore. So I'm letting those out. And in fact, those are the lectures that we read now. That's how we know about Ahriman. It was mentioned in Occult Science, but the real lectures on Ahriman and the details around it, that was all just for students originally. And I think that Steiner decided, the secrecy, just like the group of mystery schools that decided in 1840, the secrecy just isn't it. And yeah, it is dangerous to let out these very deep truths for the public at the level that they can assimilate it, And so I think that he was one of the most careful. But once World War I hit, I think he really, and of course he made the prediction around 1920 that in 100 years, the mystery schools, anthroposophy, spiritual science would get another opening to make that difference. So we're in that period. So we're talking inside of that time frame. So we're in the period of opportunity, as it were. And with that, Miss Olivia, your last question.
Okay. We can make this sort of an ad. Grant Brown wants to know, if you can get on Joe Rogan's podcast, what topics would you like to discuss?
The UFO file, the UFO file, and the UFO file. Yeah, I would do that. And I actually think a guy like Joe Rogan would want to hear the true stuff. And I think we've all had enough of this. Okay. Phony stories that fall apart, phony whistleblowers, CIA run. Have we had enough? Look, Joe even put on his best shirt for these guys, and they still came up with the worst kind of information. So, unfortunately, that's what we're dealing with. But yeah, as you can see, I'd go out and talk to them on any subject, and also all of those people like Grush and the phony CIA threatster people. They're always welcome to come on this program. We could have a gentleman's debate. I would have them on here. I mean, what's the worst thing that they could happen to them? They get some tough questions.
Humiliation.
No, I have no interest in humiliating those people. And the other thing that's interesting to me is, if anything, the people who are puppeteering there, they seem to be the most allergic to real questions, So the only questions allowed are, how do you feel, like a legend or a hero? And I'll take the slings for my family, and I'll stand up and be a Boy Scout because I love America. I mean, the CIA, they've been rolling out some pretty, but they do this. They use marginal people. This is what Professor Scott taught me, which is the CIA. They don't try to roll out the very best. They roll out marginal people, and they test them out. And then when they're no longer useful to them, Tom DeLonge.
Do you think that's because on some level they know that they're not so hot? And therefore they're grateful for the little crumbs that they get?
Interesting. Could very well be.
Mhm.
Could very, very well be. Words of wisdom from Miss Olivia there at the end. Thank you, everyone. Fantastic to be here with you. I see we have great people in the audience. I'm going to do some shout outs
I
here.
need to thank a bunch of super chatters.
Go for it.
Okay. Gillenjoy R, Tumultek O'Feargal, Ivan Langley, Trevor Hammonds, Eurythmia's Fun, Tracy Klotke, Occult Fan, Rosterman the Seer, Jay Parsons, Harvardian, Erica Swinson Elliott, Debbie McAdoo, Catherine Rorden, Les Scott, Jen S., Lisa Davey, Channeling the Heart, Robert Joyce, Christo, Carol Andrews, Amarillo Gunrunners, Boba the Clown, John Folden, Lorage, Crystal Quark, Copernicus, The Buddhas of Boston Sports, Sick of the BS, Peter Rabbit, Terry Doherty, Roosevelt Media News, Karen Carpenter, Deborah Sloan, Global Atlantis, Jam and Mammy, Calvin F. Center, Johnny Ricardo Bound, Power Broker, W.C. Ray, Joe Spindler, and Max Lupo. Thank you so much for your generous super chats.
Unbelievable. Thank you for your support. We really appreciate it. And to all our subscribers, thank you. We couldn't do what we do without you. We'll be back next week, and it's continuing in this theme. We're going deep. JFK, SSP, Blue. It's all coming your way, and a close follow-up series of episodes on DRAM. And this could be leading to a very important place. I'll do a couple of shout outs here before we go. And the Jot is out there. You guys are the best. Thank you. It's great to see you out there. Super chatters, Al Qaeda. Yes, indeed. Thank you. Jack Roper. Claws of Camelot. That's interesting. Thank you, DJ and Olivia. Proud to be a part of the good fight. Absolutely. So great to have you here. And of course, Joseph is out there. Joseph, we're talking soon. Thanks again, folks. Says Joseph. Jason May, who produced that 75 patch. That is the new patch for the intelligence group connected to the Space Force. Watch out. Yeah. They're not kidding around, I guess. This is the latest ever. I know it's very late now. Once at a Blue Moon. Had a great time again. Yes, fantastic. Ivan Langley, fantastic. Gigi Young is out there. Incredible work that Gigi has been doing. And I know we've been saying we'll have Gigi back, but the summer went crazy, and now we really are going to have her back for the fall. And watch out, because she has some great things to share, and we can't wait to have her back on the show. And Roosevelt Media News, it's great to see you, sir. Thomas Tyson, Power Broker, Esther Taylor. Wow, fantastic. What a great group out there in the Ideas Room tonight. This one's going deep. And we'll see you all next week. And remember, the subject matter of tonight's program, after all, is President Kennedy. And I have this picture of Kennedy. Let's see if I can find it before I close here. And it was, him in the Navy. And you think about this guy and the incredible impact that he had on the world, and his very careful leadership to keep us out of war, and the very important things that he did. That's a picture of him and Admiral Byrd. I guess that's appropriate for us. But just a man with a real mission and such great wisdom, I think, politically and otherwise, that, we have to remember the guy that we're tuning into about here is President Kennedy, who, after all, saved the world from a nuclear conflagration back there in 1962 with the Cuban Missile Crisis, and in his dealings for a freer world and a more open government, got us great things to look forward to. And his vision now echoing back to us 60 years after his assassination. There was a reason that they took him out, because he was aware of the incredible things that we could all do together, and he did not like this caste system. So his vision for freedom is alive today in all of us. And I think in the candidacy of RFK Jr., for sure, we're getting incredible waves of that Camelot. So never let it be forgot.
Old.
Once there was a Camelot.
So because you just presented that picture, Jack Roper had asked earlier, what was the relationship between Admiral Byrd and JFK? Were they friends?
No, there is a piece that comes up there. And so we're going to get into more on that, but I won't open it up this late, but yes, fascinating.
You're going to dangle
things.
that.
Let's just say that the International Geophysical Year brought together a lot of very interesting people. And there's also more to say in relation to Admiral Byrd's son, his unusual death, and the secrets that Admiral Byrd kept, and after he died, how his diaries, his home was broken into, his diaries were taken, and also that he wanted to put on the record when he was coming back through that Chilean journalist that something very strange had happened during high jump. Think about the incredible things that Byrd did, and his whole connection with this founding of a new territory there in Antarctica. It's absolutely amazing the things that were accomplished, and with very kind of crackly technology and incredible drive. But he is very interesting and a complex figure for a number of reasons, but absolutely fascinating. So thank you all very, very much. I know Kate's out there. It's great to see you, and we'll see you all next week.
I have low blood sugar. I'm starving.
That's it. Thank you, everyone. And, it says end broadcast, but after all, it never really ends. So we'll see you all next week.
God bless everybody.